They posted me to the church on the bluff because it had no road half the year and a caretaker who didn't mind quiet. The ice breaks late along this reach of coast. The inlet pretends to be land, then decides otherwise. The church is cedar-plank, pale as bone, where the paint sloughed off, and small enough to heat with a single drum stove if the wind behaves. It sits above the village by two switchbacks and a short run of steps the fishermen call the neck. If you carry anything heavy up the neck, you stop talking, because breath and footing are the same consideration. I came with my iron keyring and the wind-up clock wrapped in a wool watch cap. The mission's truck left me with a crate of lamp oil, a sack of flour, and a box of hymn ledgers bound in blue tape. "Spring thaw," the driver said, pointing his chin at the inlet. "She'll loosen by the new moon. You keep the bell honest." He touched the brim of his cap and turned the truck around on the last dry patch before the mud line. My routine: unlock the vestibule door, second key, smooth shank, wide bite. Strike the ice cleats across the steps to wake any drifted snow. Hang the cleats in the narthex on a nail that squeaks. Carry the kerosene lamp from the vestry. And prime the stove with 2 slips of dry spruce. In town, they say a church shouldn't smell like fuel. Up here, it smells like whatever keeps you from losing the feeling in your hands. I record the stove light in the ledger. Time, weather, chimney draw. The clock goes on the shelf behind the altar where the wind is least, and I give the mainspring 5 turns. 3 slow, 2 short. On the first morning, I checked the belfry out of respect. There is no rope. They took it years ago when the old priest died, and the bell began to ring when fog lay heavy. Someone cut the rope at the wheel and carried it to the beach and burned it. That's the story. My job now is to keep the wooden stairs to the belfry scraped and the hatch latched, to chip the rime that grows there in late March like fur. I wrote it down the way I was taught to keep a place faithful. 321, 0700, temp 28 degree. Ice stiff under crest, cleats required, stove good draw, bell, silent, hatch sound, frost on north stringer to second tread, lamp wick trimmed 1/8. Coastal Alaska doesn't give you a single wind at a time. The inlet gives you 2, one from the ocean to remind you of salt, one from the land to remind you of old snow. When they cross in the churchyard, the cedar boards lift a small cry and settle again. I learned to listen to which cry belonged to which wind. The land wind stepped hard, the ocean wind rasped. By the 3rd day, I had the schedule carved into me. Sweep snow from the sill, oil the door latch, check the hymn ledger where I mark simple tasks, walk the fenced grave plot to make sure no plank has lifted in the thaw, wind the clock. It lost 2 minutes the first night, then gained 1 the second. I wrote that down and set it right. When a building is alone with you, you keep it written. Writing keeps a line between what you do and what you think about doing. The first anomaly was small enough to shrug off. I struck the lamp at 0535 and caught a smell that belonged outside. Brine with a cold iron edge, the low tide smell that usually hunkers below the bluff, where kelp sticks to stones. It was at my elbow in the nave. I glanced at my sleeves to see if the climb had salted me. I'd brushed no spray. I raised the lamp, and the bright warmed the pew tips out of the dark. The smell did not move with the air. It seated itself near the 3rd pew on the left, as if someone had kept a wet coat there. I noted it in the ledger without a word that would tell me what to think. 323, 0535. Odor C low tide in Nav, pew L3, persisted through warm-up, no visible damp. That same morning, the bell gave its answer. Not a ring, more a willingness. A metal that had been still and now was considering movement. The belfry is wood, and wood telegraphs intention. I felt it through the ladder when I put my hand on the first rung to brush rime. A fine shiver, the weight of the bell hanging more forward than back, and then a hush like a breath drawn and held. I set the lamp on the sill and looked up the shaft. The wheel was where it had been, rope stump blackened, clapper tied in leather because someone had once meant to silence it by kindness rather than by cutting. I watched. I don't claim special senses. I have a memory for steadiness. The bell did not strike. It only leaned too long, as if the building had learned a new way to stand. I wrote that down too. 323, 0602, bell. Lean forward, 1 to 2 degree, duration 3s, no wind gust, hatch latched, deck frost, no bird. The blue-taped hymn ledger came out after breakfast. I was to catalog the old volumes for the pastor who'd return by boat when the inlet opened, a job of numbering songs, noting torn leaves, copying inscriptions. The ledgers were from 3 parishes mixed over time. My hand went slow at first. Caught 101. Be thou my vision, marginalia in pencil. Number 202, anchor holds, water stained the shape of a boot heel. Then I opened one with a crease that wouldn't smooth, and I saw a line in a tight, severe hand. Keep the 7th beat long when the wind is from the south. It was no hymn instruction I knew. I set a small dot in the margin to mark it for later, and moved on to work I understood. Routine is how you teach fear where to stand. At noon, I made the walk to the cliff edge with the cleats on. Early spring thaw is deceitful. The top inch softens under the sun and lies for you. The subsurface keeps January. I tapped my way down the neck with the iron point of my staff. The inlet below showed a gray lead opening by the river mouth. Over it hung a sound like a rope being pulled through a damp hand. I gave the water its space and took barometer readings on the step in the lee of the bell wall. 29. 92, steady, wind east by a sting on the left ear. I fed the stove, ate, and wound the clock. At 1500, the clock was ahead by 3 minutes, though I had not touched it since noon. I moved it back to the time on my wristwatch. My wristwatch keeps faith with a satellite, and the satellite keeps faith with a set of clocks floating higher than weather, and drew an underline in the ledger. The kerosene lamp flickered then, not a draft flicker, but the small birdie of flame a wick pulls when there is water in the oil. I unscrewed the cap and checked the fuel. Clear. The glass chimney was clean. I set it back and pushed the stovepipe damper a thumb width to calm the updraft. The second anomaly came with the 4 o'clock wind. You can measure wind on your skin, but a building measures it in persuasion. Doors that never mind begin to mind, glass clicks. The east wind asked a question of the west windows and was told to wait. Between one gust and the next, the bell's hush returned and stepped 1 pace further into the room. Not a sound, exactly. A delay where sound was owed. The cleats hung on their nail. The nail did not squeak. I realized then, the squeak all day had been punctual. I had bumped the cleats at every pass without meaning to, and every time the nail had answered. Now my shoulder brushed the strap and made no report. The sound came a second later, from the far side of the nave, as if the squeak had to find its way through the pews before it could reach me. I wrote it down before the part of me that wants stiffness could make a story out of it. 323, 1607. Delay ye ones between contact at cleat nail and sound. Sound localized opposite wall, no echo elsewhere. Stove steady. Barometer down, 0.02. There was a job I'd been putting off, the attic crawl to check for thaw drip over the chancel. Every building announces itself in drip season. You go up when you don't want to, and learn what the winter kept. I put on the knee pads and took the lamp and my short pry. The trap squealed its opinion. I answered with a dab of wax and a press of shoulders. The attic is low and full of old straw from when swallows found their way in years back. I pressed through on my elbows, the lamp knocking quietly against my coat. Above the chancel the boards were dry. Above the third left pew, the one with the sea smell, the underside showed a faint map of salt, not damp enough to shine, just a grain set in a pattern like fish scales. I touched it. The cedar felt cooler than the air by a breath. When I drew my hand back, the iron keyring lying on the joist clicked twice as if it had shrunk. Inventory of evidence, I told myself, not conclusions. 1. Odor of brine seated at L3 since dawn. 2. Bell lean without wind. 3. Delayed squeak, spatial shift. 4. Faint salt grain underside L3. 5. Clock gaining against wrist set, then losing. In the evening I lit the lamp early. The daylight here leaves all at once when it has made up its mind. I checked in with the mission on the hand radio. The operator in town sounded smaller than usual. Pressure falling, he said. Ice will let go under moonrise. Keep the bell honest. If anybody up there needs help, that's your job. He meant the village, but I looked up the shaft anyway. I slept in the vestry on a folding cot with the lamp hooded and the clock set only once more. The wind-up ticked a calm grammar into the dark. When the stove clicked as the last split took, the click arrived from the wrong corner, small as a hinge. The building breathed. It wasn't a wrongness I could hold out in front of me and name. It was a pattern gone 5th beat. I listened until my ears made their own sound, and then I wound the clock 1 extra half turn and set the iron key ring on my chest to feel its weight. Before sleep, I wrote my own rule in the hymn ledger, on a blank rear page where the tape still held. Keep the hours even, keep the records plain, sing nothing a second time until you know who is listening. Then I crossed it out once so I wouldn't be clever later, and believe myself. I woke to the bell deciding between two truths. The building leaned toward it with me, as if we were characters in a lesson. The clapper did not fall. A very long moment ended, and left behind a smaller one. The wind, when it came from both directions at once and tested every seam. Morning would want the stairs scraped, the inlet watched, the barometer read again. Before I blew out the lamp, I rewrote the date I had already written, though I did not know why, and turned the clock 1 minute slow to make room for the day to fit inside it. At first light, the inlet was a sheet of ideas pretending to be ice. You could see the river's black push working a seam out toward the mouth, a long wrist cutting a cuff. My clock woke me early by gaining again. 3 minutes ahead, though I had set it slow. I wound it down to match the wristwatch and wrote in the ledger 3:24, 0531, clock plus 3 wo aji, corrected. Barometer 29.76 falling, wind undecided, sky pearl gray. The cleats bit the steps clean, each tooth a small relief. The strap brushed the nail and gave me nothing back at first touch. Then the squeak arrived from the rear pews, patient and sure. I tried the experiment 3 times. The delay was consistent, count 1 and, between contact and report. I marked it, delay 0.50. Sevens, source drifts between nave L mid and choir rail. Inside, the cold had worked an art on the windows overnight. Frost rose from the sills in fine verticals, not the usual ferns. They were straight tally marks, a neat hand writing up the inside of the glass in strokes as evenly spaced as fence pickets. The marks were more numerous on the south windows than the north, which made no sense for what I knew of sun and radiators when a place has none. The nearest stove heat had brushed those panes, and still the frost had drawn itself up, like disciplined breath. I lifted the lamp to see the pattern better. The marks were subtly not parallel. Each leaned a degree toward the belfry, a choir turning its faces to an absent cantor. The left third pew, the Brine pew, held the smell again as steady as if someone had opened a bucket of Tide and set it under the hymn shelf. The wood beneath my fingers felt cooler than the air by the width of a thought. I steadied my hand by touching the iron keyring. It was warmer than the pew, which is the opposite of what iron prefers at dawn. I made tea on the stove and listened to the inlet, learning its voice. When ice loosens, it talks in small throats before the big ones arrive. Pop, sigh, a curiously conversational sound halfway between wood settling and oars dipped. The bell gave no ring, only its consideration. Lean forward, come back, lean forward. I could time it now. Every 7 minutes it entered its long breath and took 3 seconds to give it up. I wrote that down and bracketed it. 0706, 0733, 0720. The clock, for once, agreed. The day's work wanted the roof gutters cleared of wind-blown needles and one seam tested for leak. I slung the rope and the short hook, laced the cleats tight, and stepped out into brightness that did not feel like warmth. Early spring thaw is 2 things at once, a correction in the books and a temptation to go light. I kept my weight low on the ladder and tapped each rung with the hook to keep time with myself. From the roofline, the village downshore looked like a row of shrugging shoulders, smoke thin, dogs nosing the edge where snow had pulled back. A skiff sat high on blocks with its engine under a tarp, patient the way tools are when they know they will be needed again. From that high edge, the church's footprint made more sense to me. A narrow nave, square chancel, little vestry shouldered on like a pack. The belfry towered ahead above, its hatch latched with my small brass hasp and the extra nail the fisherman had added. I cleared the needles and the one loose shingle and sat for a count of 20 to see where melt would go. It went where gravity said it should, off the south eaves, into the barrel, down the chain that doubles for a downspout when the winter tries to pull the gutter free. I was measuring what behaved so I'd see what did not. Something did not. When I climbed down and crossed the yard, I found prints along the packed path that belonged to neither dog nor boot I know. They were marks of pressure, not shape, an ovoid stress where crust had been asked to hold and had managed, then softened and taken a shallow memory. Each was the length of my palm. The spacing was patient and even, set too narrow for a person's stride and too regular for Fox. They ran from the porch steps to the fence, then veered along the fence toward the cliff. At the cliff, they stopped short of the edge. No scuffing, as if someone had turned. Just stopped. My breath showed in short puffs and then hid. The wind had chosen east for the hour, and my left ear stung its report. I knelt to measure and felt the familiar tug to decide. I didn't. I took facts. Depth 8 to 12 meters, spacing 41-43 centimeters, direction from door to fence, no backtrack, no meltwater pooled in each. I set the edge of the iron key on 1 to fix scale and took a pencil rubbing on a card from the hymn ledger box. The graphite caught almost nothing because there was almost nothing to catch. The church fence creaked then, and the creak came from behind me, though the fence in front moved. I stood and watched the boards take their time matching their sound. At 9:30, the mission radio coughed its way into the nave. Caretaker Bluff. Copy? The voice had that mitten quality the repeater gives everyone. Copy, I said. Barometer falling. I'll keep the bell. You seeing any village traffic? No traffic, I said. And then because it felt like part of the job to tell the truth, even if it sounded thin, I'm keeping a list of anomalies. Silence sat on the line. Put your name and date on it, the operator said. We only keep lists that have owners. Then he signed with the weather. Wind east, ice uncertain, be neighborly. I split and stacked the spruce, wrote be neighborly in the margin next to keep the 7th beat long, then crossed both very lightly the way I do with rules I'm not ready to obey. The hymn work went slower. The ledger with the severe hand came up twice more. Directives hidden as notations. Hold the last note at doors. Count the waves as rests. I recopied them to a separate page marked index, then felt foolish and underlined the word so I'd feel less foolish the next time I saw it. By noon, the frost lines on the south windows had risen an inch higher, still straight, still leaning a degree toward the belfry. I pressed my thumb to a pane and felt, not the expected melt and wet, but a dryness like paper. The frost did not smudge under the heat of me. Instead, minute pellets formed along the base of each stroke, as if something had condensed and beaded and then hardened in place. Salt will do that on a rail after a storm, but we had had no spray on this bluff for days, only breath from the inlet and the steady inland cold. I tasted one grain on the tip of a knife the way a person used to salting fish learns to confirm without wasting. Not sweet, not bitter, near enough to brine to be considered. At 13:17, the bell gave 3 small considerations in quick succession. No more than a tremble at the latter, but enough to draw the air into a narrow place. I heard the clock tick louder for a handful of beats, as if the case had been opened. The delay squeak returned its verdict from the choir rail. I wrote again until the page felt too busy to be trusted, then flipped and began a numbered list with lines left for later additions. Anomaly log, Caretaker Bluff, JK 324, Bell, periodic lean 6-7 min cadence, cluster 113 X3, no wind gust corresponding. Sound, cleat nail squeak delayed 8.5.7s, apparent source drifts, fence creak mislocated. Scent, Brine localized at Nave L3 since 3:23, persistent. Thermal, Pew L3 surface cooler by touch. Attic underside above L3 exhibits fine salt grain. Frost, vertical lines inside south windows, leaning 1 gauge toward belfry, non-melting under touch, salt-like pellets at base. Temporal, wind-up clock gains unpredictably, also ticks louder during bell consideration. Tracks, shallow pressure ovals, path door, fence, cliff, spacing 41-43 centimeter, terminated edge, no return. At 1500, ice thundered somewhere downshore, like a bar dropped on a floor, and then again farther off, softer, as if the sound had to walk a distance before it reached me. The church listened in its timber way. The windows sang a short bright tone, then stopped, the way glass does when a train passes miles inland. The inlet had found a new seam. I checked the bell hatch and felt for draft. None. The leather on the clapper was sound, the knot old but competent. I put the iron keyring on the sill to hear if it would tell me anything, then felt foolish and pocketed it again. Late afternoon, I took the ice cleats and followed the prints along the fence to the cliff to see what the edge would offer. The wind had settled to a sustained east with a little curl from the south, like 2 thoughts in one head. Looking down, I saw water moving under a skin in sheets, flexing, shining, darkening. On the frozen part of the cove below, a single line ran from the river seam to the beach, a ruler's path etched by pressure. It pulsed, not with waves, with a timing I could have sung to if I hadn't promised myself not to. 3 beats, rest, 3 beats, rest, and once, because I had learned to count these things now, a 7th beat that hung too long. I marked the cadence on the back of my glove with pencil and backed away from the edge. When the east wind freshened, the churchyard board under my boot gave its creak from the place where I stood instead of the far wall, and for a foolish second I felt grateful to it for behaving. Then the cleat strap slipped and the squeak went to the choir rail again like a dog to its cushion. Dusk tried the door before it came in. I closed the shutters on the south windows and left the north to see what the frost would do. I lit the lamp and set it low to keep the stovepipe from hunting. I wound the clock 5 even turns and put the hymn ledger where I could reach it in a hurry, should I need to write what would otherwise forget itself. The smell of brine in the nave eased, replaced by a faint metal note like damp nails in a bucket. The mission radio called once more, a short check and the reminder that people downshore might ring if they needed to, and I should listen. "No rope," I said before I could stop myself. "You keep it honest anyway," the operator said, as if there were more than one way to do that. When full dark settled, the frost on the open north windows began to show the same disciplined lines, rising from the sill as if written by a hand I could not see. I watched until the lamp hissed soft and the stove contracted in little clicks. For a span of 8 ticks of the clock, the bell leaned its long breath and did not return on the 9th tick. It returned on a 10th. The difference felt inside my ribs. I added 8-10 count on bell lean at 1914 and set down the pencil. The wind had found its night shape. The inlet would loosen further by moonrise, and with looseness comes voices. I checked the lock on the porch door, the hasp on the hatch, the latch on the vestry window. Then I took the iron keyring and set it at the edge of the hymn ledger, as if to hold the page down against weather. And I turned the clock 1 minute slow again, making room for the time it takes to learn the rules of a place. Before sleep I wrote one more line on the index page, then scratched it faintly so it could be read 2 ways. When a measure goes long, be specific. I blew the lamp to a low blue and let the church count for me while the inlet tried its new voice against the cliff. Somewhere between the 9th and 10th tick, something tapped the choir rail like a knuckle learning politeness. The church woke me with the small sound I'd begun to expect, a delayed answer from wood that had been asked a question a second prior. It came from the choir rail, polite as a cough in a library. The clock had gained again, but not as much. 2 minutes ahead, though I had set it slow at lights out. I took it back to the wristwatch and noted 3:25, 0528, clock +2, corrected. Barometer 29.64 and falling. Wind light east with a south habit, sky blue-gray. I added moonset 0621 from the tide card I kept folded in the hymn ledger box. My first job was simple. Sweep frost pellets off the south sill, where last night's vertical lines had climbed. The pellets rolled like coarse salt. I felt for damp under them, and found none. The pane still carried its neat hand of marks, now higher by the thickness of a hymn book. I wrote, "Frost lines continue, rate 12 to 15mm12, lean toward belfry persists." Outside, the inlet was half-lidded, black leads widening in a bright crust. Ice does not surrender evenly. It chooses seams and persuades outward. The village downshore sent up a thin line of smoke from one house. A dog's bark came to me, then came again from nearer, as if the church had spoken on its behalf. I listened to the yardboards for their morning creak and got the now familiar delay. Contact at the east board, report from the west. The prints along the fence had kept their patience overnight. No drift had softened them, and they had not melted out as such shallow impressions ought to when the day stays above freezing at noon. They were ovals of decision, each the size of my palm, and now there was a new run of them, beginning at the porch instead of the step. The first 2 sat close together, as if whatever made them had waited to choose a direction. The choice was toward the cliff again. I went to work with intention rather than curiosity. I took the iron key ring for scale, the short tape, the staff, and my folding square of cardboard, where I draw first and think second. I measured 4 spans, 42, 41, 42, 43 centimeters. Consistency breeds trust. Outliers deserve writing. Each impressed perhaps a finger deep. I pressed the edge of the tape in beside one and felt the crust under it give the smallest way, like a good board conceding a nail. The sensation lived more in the glove than the palm, cooler than air, not wet. Procedures keep me honest. I snapped a chalk line from the porch to the fence and set my square across it at every 3rd mark. The centers lined close to true until the fence corner, where the run drifted 5 degrees toward the south. The drift carried on to the cliff path and stopped at the edge exactly as yesterday's had. No scuff, no skid, no heel where a person would brace. I leaned out on my staff to look for a scramble below. The ledge 20 feet down showed only what the inlet had done. Ice torn like fabric, dark water new as thought. But just to the right of where the path ended, the hardy grass that grows on the very lip bore a trace of salt rime inland. At dawn on a southerly, sea breath will write on grass, but the smear line curved back toward the yard as if the wind had pushed into the cliff, then returned. I tasted it on a knife point. Brine enough to count. I logged it as a map might. Tracks. Addle Run, 3:25 dawn, porch, fence, cliff. Drift 5 to Gir S at corner. Termination as before. Salt. Faint inland rime arc on cliff grass, 0.5 mmr of path terminus. Wind light, ERS mix, record as anomaly. I took the cleats and followed the fence farther than yesterday, stepping where the crust held, tapping ahead. The sun sat higher now, making that white blaze which cuts the edges off things. At the far end of the fence, the path bent down toward the narrow beach that's accessible only on a good low. I stood where a person would check the tide and consulted my card. Low, slack at 11:34, range modest. It was 2 hours yet. Where I stood, the snow carried old tracks of mine and one fox's, recognizable, haphazard, translating the slope in small, practical diagonals. Among those, today's ovals threaded between in a straight patience. By mid-morning, the inlet spoke in more serious terms. A long, hollow thud traveled under the ice and came up through the church ground with a sensation rather than a sound, as if my boots had listened before my ears. The bell leaned its breath at 7-minute regulars, and once, in the Euro 9:49 bracket, it leaned 5 seconds longer. The clock made a choice to keep time with that longer lean and gained half a minute in those 5 seconds. When I set it back, I felt the mainspring resist more than usual. A small ache through the key that ran into my wrist. The hymn ledger work gave me something my hands knew while my ears worked on the problem. I index now as a matter of discipline. It is how I keep the story of a place from choosing me before I choose it. On page 12 of the severe hand, a marginal line read, "For water hymns, match to tide, leave a rest for the set." It angered me gently, to have counsel where I wanted proof. I wrote set with a question mark, as if the page owed me a reply. It did not. At 11:10 I decided the beach might be kind enough for a look. The sun had softened the top inch. Beneath, the old cold held. I took the staff, lamp, and a coil of clothesline for caution. The yard boards gave their delayed creak. The cleat strap gave its delayed squeak. Both I noted and accepted the way one accepts recurrences in the body at a certain age. The neck down to the beach is a stitched path, 2 planks set wide where a spring runs under snow. Today the spring sang very low. The sea smell came up, clean and inner, not like rot. At the bottom, the last run to shingle was short and direct. The beach lay half under ice slabs tilted like books on a shelf. Beyond, the lead to the river showed a slow push west, unhurried ice giving room to more water. I stood on black pebbles and saw them, the ovals, faint but sure, on the crusted sand between 2 slabs. They had impressed so lightly that the first gloss of melt had taken them almost away, but not away. They ran from the path's last board straight into the lead and disappeared at the same cadence I had measured above. I placed the keyring for scale and took a rubbing because I could, though graphite knows little of sand. I put my glove hand in the lead water and felt the particular cold of river mixed with tide, the way it needles, but the surface besides my hand went still for a count of 2, where it should have riffled lakewise against an incoming trickle, a pocket of no motion. Then the usual ripple returned, as if a decision had been made elsewhere. I looked up at the bluff out of instinct rather than need, and marked a quiet shift that would have been easy to miss. The bell louver had a thin halo of rime on its inland edge, as if some dampness had touched it from the inside, and then met the morning. Rime does not usually choose the lee. I put that in a pocket and saved it. At 11:34, the tide card kept its promise. Slack quieted the stringers, and in that pause a different sound climbed the bluff. 3 beats, rest. 3 beats, rest. I told myself it was ice tearing at the river mouth. The rhythm was too neat. There came a 7th beat that hung and broke in 2, like a word someone decided not to say. I wrote it in shorthand on the glove, 3, 3, 7, break. The bell did not strike, but the latter felt briefly lighter under my hand when I returned to the yard, as if the bell had asked to be another inch forward and then taken it back out of courtesy. Inside, the scent at the third left pew had thinned, replaced by a faint ozone note, like a battery kept awake too long. The frost lines on the north panes had climbed to match the south. The pellets along their bases had arranged themselves in 2 rows without my help, a lower line and an upper, as if the window had been measured by a hand I couldn't see. I held the lamp near and watched one pellet dislodge and leap. No melt preceding it, no drip trailing, just a dry, tiny jump from lower row to upper, and rest. I put the lamp down gently. The clock's tick had lengthened its space between ticks without altering count. I went to the vestry and took out the tide book the old priest had left. Alaska coast, western reaches, 12-year, and confirmed the set times around equinox. The little graphs, black on yellowing paper, gave no cause for oddity. But behind the shelf the plaster carried a faint line of damp from low to high, a ladder shadow where there is no ladder. I pressed with a knuckle, cold, not wet. I wrote, Wall cold stripe vestry W, 0.9 m, 1.5 in AGL, correlates 3, 3, 7 break, and circled the question mark. Neighborliness nudged. I put the radio to my ear and raised the village. The same mittened voice answered from the repeater. Folks are watching the river let go, he said. Any bell today? Only the idea of one, I said. I have prints again, down to the water. A pause, then the voice lighter. Seals will come through on the first open. They mark the snow odd sometimes. These don't shape like seals, I said. They don't shape like much. You keep notes, he said. Notes are a fence when there's not an actual fence. After the call, I took another turn through the church with the iron key ring in my palm to keep me from turning my hand into a fist. I stopped at pew L3 and placed the ring on the hymnal shelf. It sat. It did not hum. It kept the page open where I had copied the severe hands lines. I set the wind-up clock 1 minute slow again, both to make room for what I did not understand and to see if it would take the invitation. Then I went out the west side to the grave plot, where the boards had lifted a finger's width with the thaw. I pressed them back into their seating and drove a wedge. When I stood, the wedge creaked from the wrong direction and then corrected itself, a child catching its manners. By late afternoon, the sun made that white glaze at the horizon that is not warmth, but that people who are weary accept as if it were. I carried the rope to the belfry steps and checked each tread with the lamp for frost. On the third tread, where I had written fir 2 days ago, the frost was gone, but the wood was beaded with tiny, very regular droplets that did not run. They reflected the lamp in a beaded row. When the bell gave its 7-minute breath, I felt a cool pass my cheek, like a cat deciding a room belonged to both of us. An addition to the log before dark. 8. Beach. Ovals continue. Water. Cadence holds on sand. Pocket of still surface 2s, beside hand at lead. Louver rhyme lee side. 9. Vestry. Cold stripe on wall. Height band matches thought of set. 10. Window. Pellet hopped row to row while melt. 2-row arrangement noted. As I closed the shutters, a note in the ledger's index I hadn't written greeted me in the severe hands diction, though the ink was the same as mine. If you count, count aloud softly. I set the book down. My own left margin bore a faint mark where no pencil had touched, 3 short ticks and 1 long, like a notation for musicians too proud to say so. I held the page to the lamp. The mark was indent only, not graphite, as if pressed by a nail through paper. The church tested its timbers with the evening pressure and decided to hold them. I took the iron key ring and set it on the windowsill to keep a page of the tide book down against a breeze that was not there. I wound the clock its careful turns. I blew the lamp down to a steady hiss. When I lay on the vestry cot, the inlet called the cliff by its new name, 337 with a break. And from somewhere in the nave something answered low. Not the bell, not the stove, not any settle I'd catalogued. Just a quiet tap at the rail, learning politeness, finding the beat that the rest of the place had already set for it. I did not sing. I did not even hum. I counted to myself, even, plain, and kept the numbers in my mouth where they could not dress themselves as comfort and go out among the pews without me. I woke to the clock already arguing with me. I had set it slow before sleep. Now it stood even with the wristwatch and beat a little louder, like a student reciting to make sure I heard. I marked it without praise or blame. 3's 26, 0532. Clock corrected itself overnight. Tick amplitude, barometer 29. 51 and falling. Wind east with south habit. Sky milk blue. Moonset had come and gone. The inlet would be busy making decisions. The windows had written more of their hand in the night. the straight frost strokes rose another thumb's breadth on both north and south panes. What I'd called pellets now showed a third, finer row between the other two, a staff line added after the music began. Each stroke still leaned a degree toward the belfry. I pressed a fingernail to one line. It neither smudged nor melted, but a thin filament resolved at the edge, like drawn sugar when you pull it too far, and it goes to hair. I cut it away with a knife tip and set it on the ledger page. Dry. If there was a rule for that, I had not read it yet. The brine seat at the third left pew had thinned to a suggestion and been replaced by a dry, metallic breath, as if tools had been sharpened without filings left behind. The pew surface kept its cooler-than-air trick by the width of a thought. I touched the iron keyring and felt it warmer than the wood again. In the attic crawl above that pew, the cedar underside showed salt grain finer than before, now in rows, not rivulets, not random. The rows bent minutely toward the belfry the way the frost lines leaned. I wrote attic L3, salt micro rows, fall line biases belfry word, then came back down for the kettle. It was Sunday by the mission calendar. The village keeps its own ways, but I have a line of jobs for Sundays so the day has a shape. Sweep the aisle, wipe the rails, set out the blue-taped hymn ledgers in order, wind the clock as if it were a parishioner who deserves courtesy. I aired the nave, then closed the shutters to keep the frost draft from undoing the stove's simple work. I counted pews in a low voice to keep the room honest. The delayed squeak from the cleat nail answered from the choir rail with its now familiar half-second gap. At 0700, the bell offered its long, lean 3 seconds and recovered. At 0707, again. At 0714, it held 4 seconds, an extra beat that sat in my ribs. The clock kept the same count, and then, as if satisfied with itself, lost half a minute between one tick and the next. I wound it one turn to make sure there was fairness between us and recorded bell cadence 7 mestos, occasional +1s, clock, micro loss, 030 lost, at 0715 without wind or draft. After tea, I took the hymn ledgers to the front rail and laid them spine out for the dusty congregation that would not come. The Severe Hands book opened on its own to the page I had indexed last. For water hymns, match to tide, leave a rest for the set. Below that, written more faintly, indent, not graphite, lay a line I had not seen. Do not sing on the long seventh by habit. I touched it. The paper did not bruise. I copied the words to my index with the same small letters I use when I don't want to grant authority. Don't sing on the seventh by habit. I tested another thing whose habit I thought I knew. I took the wind-up clock off its shelf and set it on the front pew where the room feels any small draft. I placed the iron keyring on top to make the case answer to the weight. Then I struck a single note from the pitch pipe the old priest kept, a quiet A, meant for tuning voices that would not be here. The note sat in the nave and went away. The clock ticked without comment. I tried a soft hum, 3 short, a rest, then 3, and felt foolish as soon as breath left me. The bell did nothing, but the frost strokes on the south pane seemed to glint together, a trick of light I could not prove. I wrote sound test, 0808, pitch A, then hum, 3, rest, 3 low, no bell response, windows glinted, subjective, circle later. By 0900, the inlet's voice grew older. Under ice thuds traveled shoreward and picked up a rhythm I did not welcome, 3, 3, 7 with a break. The churchyard boards creaked dutifully with their delay, east underfoot, west by ear. The fence gave its counterpoint. The prints from yesterday, ovals of decision, had stale edges now, but a new set, shallower, quicker, ran from the porch to the path. They threaded along the fence with that same 5-degree southern drift at the corner and paused at the cliff. I measured, spacing 41-42 centimeters, depth less, 5 to 7 millimeters. The crust had set firmer overnight, yet the record held. The run stopped where the ground dropped, and when I leaned on my staff and peered down, a fresh narrow seam in the cove ice below showed a faint ripple that seemed out of step with the wind. I could not make myself write out of step, so I drew a short line with 2 dots and a longer line with a split. Back inside, the mission radio came through the repeater with that mittened caution. "Caretaker Bluff, you good?" The voice was not the usual operator. "Good," I said. "Inlet is working the river mouth. Any boats out?" "No boats," he said. "We're hearing a hum west side." "What kind?" "Like a line singing," he said, and I could tell he didn't want to use a word that would make it church. Power? I asked. Lines are downriver, he said. This is another kind of line. He paused. You keeping the bell honest? I'm keeping the record, I said. That'll do, he said, and clicked off, as if a record were something a person could eat. Sunday wants a hymn even if none are sung. I set the lamp on the chancel step and took up the ledger with the severe hand and turned to Nearer My God to Thee, which men hum when they run out of other things, and copied the first stanza to a loose card so I wouldn't mark the old page with anything that wasn't mine. I stood at the rail and spoke, not sang, each line in an even measure the way you'd read directions for boiling a potato. The sound behaved. The pews breathed the way wood breathes when it has decided not to hold a winter any longer. On the second verse, when the line wanted a long seventh note, I reduced it to a spoken beat, small and plain. The bell leaned in that moment, 3 seconds, and returned. My throat went dry as if I had been caught making something I could not explain. I wrote, Spoken hymn, 1006. Avoided long seventh, bell leaned during avoidance, not when held. Data, avoid pattern making. Rule, do not test more than twice per day. I took the cleats and checked the steps because a job is a wall against the part of the mind that would build a different church so it could have easier mysteries. On the second tread, a frost hair had grown from the riser toward my boot. So thin it could be breath, so straight it had to be something else. I ran the back of my knife through it. It snapped clean and lay across the wood like a single white hair fallen from a head that had never been in this room. I added, riser, frost filament, 18mm long, true, snapped, more on treads, monitor. After midday, the inlet found a new seam and told us with a long belly sound that arrived in the attic before it reached my ear. The bell gave its lean then, and the clock took 2 ticks where there should have been 1, and corrected with a soft double beat. Embarrassed. I put the clock back on the altar shelf without speaking to it, as if to spare it the shame of being remanded. A gust put a handful of sun through a hole in the overcast, and in that brief brightness the frost strokes on the windows hardened their 3-row pellet bases into tiny facets, like the scales on a fish laid on a board. Some facets caught the light from the lamp and held it longer than they should have. I stood very still. The facets dimmed together, not one by one. I don't have a form for that in the ledger. I wrote, facets dimmed together, and underlined together too hard so that the paper shined. In the late afternoon, I walked the grave plot with the iron keyring in my palm, so I'd have a weight that was mine. The boards had lifted at the south corner again. I tamped them and set a wedge. The wedge reported its creak from the wrong direction first, then corrected, and the correction sounded too pleased with itself. The wind felt like metal on the left side of the face and paper on the right. The prints at the fence's far end had resumed after their pause, this time angling down toward the narrow path that only exposes on a hungry low. We did not have a hungry low. The tide was merely dutiful, keeping its math. I wrote, Tracks S extension indicate intent beyond available shore. Record and do not follow until safe. Near dusk, a thin rime ring appeared around the bell's leather knot, where the clapper was gentled against the bronze. It looked as if someone had breathed there very carefully. I climbed to the hatch and checked with the back of my hand. The air felt cooler by a degree next to the knot than at the hatch, though a draft should have gone the other way. I scraped the rime with my thumb and smelled nothing but cedar and cold. The leather itself seemed too supple for its age. I pushed the hatch closed and set the hasp without overdoing it. I came down and let the church have its last light. On Sundays, I allow myself the wind-up clock's chime for the hour, a small permission in a place that keeps you within yourself. It chimed 6, and then, after a polite delay, chimed 6 again very softly, as if practicing. I did not make a note of that one. There are some entries you keep in your head, so the ledger doesn't grow a personality from having to carry them. The radio murmured, the village voice, the usual one this time. Ice is stepping back, he said. We're hearing that hum still. I'm reading along, I said. If anyone asks for the bell, I'll... Keep it honest, he finished, and I let him have that victory. I closed the shutters on the south, left the north open to see if the frost hand would write past midnight, and set the hymn ledgers by the rail with the severe hand's volume on top, because I had the sense it wanted to be on top, and I didn't yet know whether I was indulging the book or myself. I placed the iron keyring on the index card to hold it where I could reach it when the habit came to write. When the lamp went to its evening hiss, the inlet gave the cliff its name again, 337 with a tidy break. And from the choir rail, the polite tap answered on the break, as if learning. I spoke one line of a hymn under my breath and cut the seventh into a small spoken beat. The bell leaned exactly then and returned. The clock took the opportunity to lose a minute and then find it again without my hand. I ended the day with additions to the log. Hymns, spoken verses, avoidance of long seventh coincides with bell lean, do not conclude, limit tests. Windows, third pellet row, frost filaments, facets dim dwell together. Bell clapper, rhyme ring inland side of knot, local coolness near leather, draft counterintuitive. Clock, self-correcting behavior, double chime after delay, soft, amplitude. I wrote one more line at the bottom of the page and made it as plain as I could so I wouldn't mistake it for advice. Keep measure, but do not keep time for what does not ask it of you. Then I wound the clock one careful turn, set it 1 minute slow to make room, trimmed the lamp's wick to a neat oval, and lay on the vestry cot with the keyring in my hand until the church's breaths gathered themselves into something like sleep. The inlet counted out there with its new grammar. In here, the choir rail tapped a soft agreement on the rests, and the frost hand, though I would not turn to look, continued its tallies up the glass as if the room itself had begun to read. The inlet stopped arguing for an hour at dawn. It didn't go still, ice never does that when it breaks, but the argument softened to a private conversation under the surface. A kind of breathing you only hear if you have lived with the same house too many winters. The clock had kept itself even with the wristwatch twice in the night, and gained once. I wrote the arithmetic plain so I wouldn't be tempted to see mind in a mainspring. 327, 0530, 0, plus 0, then 1, corrected. Barometer 29.38 falling, wind east with a south decision below it, air 31-degree light fog on the cove. The windows had written the frost hand higher again. The 3 pellet rows at each pane's base now suggested a staff, and the straight strokes climbing from them had begun to stagger, not randomly, but in a long, short pattern that made my tongue want to count without asking me. I kept my mouth shut and my pencil working. Lean toward belfry persists. Rate slowed to 8 ts 10 me more smooth. Staggering begins. The brine seat at the third left pew had weakened to a ghost and was replaced by the cold iron smell that tools give when they have been working in a room you forgot to stand in. Under my palm, the pew felt cool in a way that outlasted my hand's heat. I pressed the iron keyring to it and felt the ring warmer than the wood again, then caught myself standing there listening to the absence of anything foolish. The delayed squeak from the cleat nail was back, politely late by a beat and a half, coming from the choir rail, the west wall, then, once, no place at all, as if it had chosen to skip the room and return smaller. Outside, in the first fog, the prints along the fence were still patient. A new run had started in the night from the porch's side, not the step. They had cut across my boot line to the cliff and stopped again with that same neat refusal to lean into the drop. The spacing stayed faithful, 41 to 43 centimeters, and the depth had shallowed to a few millimeters where the crust had refrozen in the late dark. Beyond the edge, down on the cove ice, a long, low seam had opened toward the river mouth. It pulsed, 3 and 3, and that long seventh that breaks, not in sound, in attention. I made the rounds, stove draft, good, lamp wick trimmed, one on, belfry hatch latch secure, leather at clapper still showing the faint inland rime when the light struck crosswise. I touched the knot with the back of my hand. Cooler there, again, by a degree that only the nerves in a working hand learn to count. The bell offered its 7-minute lean at 0628 and again at 635. At 0642, it held 1 second longer and then counted itself back, almost shy. I wrote the times, drew a bracket, underlined once. On the hour, I lifted the mission radio. The repeater gave the same mitten distance to the voice. Caretaker Bluff, we've got fog down shore. You seeing much? Enough to write, I said. Any traffic? No boats, he said. We had a call after midnight. Old Sam heard a line singing west side. Could be ice on rock. Could be the other thing. He let that lie between us where the repeater couldn't make it church. Keep the bell honest, he added. Then, maybe because that felt like a kind of prayer, and he is careful with those. And keep the stove too. Silence has a weight when a place has spent 3 days teaching you where to put your ear. Around mid-morning, the inlet's far thudding paused. The fog pulled closer to the bluff and draped itself over the churchyard fence, making the boards look like a line underlined by itself. The delayed squeak did not arrive when I brushed the cleat strap. The yard board gave me the right creak from the right place on the first try. I went to the window and pressed my palm to the glass. The frost hand had risen, but the little facets were dull, not bright. The 3 pellet rows at the base felt like sand under a page. When I brought the lamp near, nothing jumped. I noted it without deciding. Mid-morning lull, delays vanish, facets dull, no jump at heat. A caretaker's job in a thaw is gutters and edges, and places that have been quiet long enough to plan something. I slung the rope and went to the roof. The fog made the inlet sound near and far by turns. From that height, I could see the village smoke smear itself in the damp air, then be erased as if 2 winds had contradicted each other and called it a draw. The belfry's louver boards bore a fine inner rim of rime on the lee again, inland side. I put a finger on the wood and left no print. Dry, cold, not wet. I put that in the ledger because dry cold can lie. From the eaves, when the fog thinned, the cove showed a pale oval where something had touched the surface. Not a hole, not a splash. A pressure pallor, as if a pan had been lowered into water and lifted straight out. The oval shared the same patience as the prints, palm length, multiplied. It gave me no direction, only a count, 4, then a gap, then 3 in a line that seemed too deliberate for tide. Neighborliness tugged at me again. I took the hand radio and walked down the neck toward the switchback, where the repeater wakes quickly. Village Bluff, I said. We've got a quiet hour. You good? Good, the voice came back. We're hearing less of the hum. Fog makes it small. He hesitated, or I heard hesitation through the mitten. Somebody asked if you'd ring for the noon checks. Old worry. No rope, I said. The old answer. Keep it honest anyway, he said, and coughed. The line closed. I stood at the switchback and looked back at the church in fog. It wore the weather like a habit, hood up, face down. The prints along the fence had softened a little at the edges, where the fog's breath had been patient. I measured one again because doing that saves you from certain kinds of thought. 42 centimeters, and the crust under it did the small concession the tape tip asks from it. That concession comforted me more than it should have. Inside, the hymn ledgers waited on the rail, the Severe Hands book on top, its blue tape smooth as dressing. I opened it without looking down and landed on a page where I had copied a line 2 days ago. Only this time the copy wasn't mine. It was pressed into the paper underneath in the same tight hand. Leave the 7th empty when the water is working. I set the lamp back and let the idea sit without giving it management. The clock was at even time and ticking softly. I wound it 1 even turn, set it 1 minute slow to make room for whatever the day might need, and went to the vestry. The vestry west wall still carried the cold stripe I had found, 0.9 to 1.5 meters above the floor. It had widened by a finger, not damp, only cold in a way that made a kneecap think of river. I put my knuckle to it and felt that searching cold you get in bones when weather makes a promise without a schedule. I wrote, stripe widens a finger, not wet, ribs feel it, subjective, may correlate to lull. At noon I did the ordinary thing that felt like wearing a name tag in a town not mine. I walked the aisle and stood at the rail and spoke, not sang, the noon hymn with my voice as small and even as I could keep it. I shortened the 7th. The bell did not lean. The clock kept time. The delayed squeak did not play its trick. For one slow verse, the room chose to be only a room. I held the ledger where it could see that I was writing. 1200. Spoken hymn, 7th omitted, no bell lean, all latencies nil. Then I closed the book, because silence in a room like that is its own kind of talk, and you don't step on somebody who is taking the trouble to be plain with you. After lunch, the inlet picked its voice back up. The first long thud under the ice knocked softly at the belfry ladder. The bell offered the idea of a lean and changed its mind. The delayed squeak returned, all at once and with too much politeness, as if it had been listening outside the door and come in on cue. The windows brightened their facets a little, and then were dull again. The prints at the fence did not advance. The oval pale places on the cove water multiplied by 2. I wrote it all and made myself neat. The afternoon gave me work I could name. A loose hinge on the vestry window, a split board at the grave plot's south corner, a drift of needles in the gutter, the lamp's wick behaving like a child angel in a painting who has been told to be good. I tightened, spliced, brushed, trimmed. The moral pressure of a job is safety, when you don't know what it might cost to believe something you can't say out loud. Near dusk, with fog thinning, the village sent a voice again. If anybody needs the bell, it'd be around now. He meant that the ice. He meant the skiff owners who look at a seam and want a sound to agree with their worry. "No rope," I said. "I can put a hand to the wheel if asked." "Don't," he said quickly, then lighter, almost joking. "Keep it honest by not inventing honesty." The line clicked empty. I climbed to the hatch anyway because caretaking is as much not doing as doing. I checked the leather knot. The rime ring had formed once more on the inland side. When I breathed near it, it refused to gloss. I placed my palm near the clapper, near, not on, and felt a cool that did not belong to any draft. I counted to 7 in my mouth, small, even. Nothing moved except my counting. The church breathed as a house does when it is tired and won't say so. Back on the nave floor, the frost strokes had climbed to eye level. The stubborn staggering of long and short was more obvious. When the lamp passed close, one pellet on the middle row dropped to the lower, then another climbed. I wrote, "Exchange of pellets between rows," and stopped, because I was about to write a word that would sound like a conclusion, and the ledger is not for that. Evening required closing shutters. I left one north pane open to keep faith with my own bad habit of wanting a scrap of evidence after lights out. I set the wind-up clock 1 minute slow again. It accepted with the little dignity a good mechanism carries. I put the iron key ring on the severe hands ledger to hold the index page down. The key ring clicked once on the cover, then clicked again a second later from the rail, though I hadn't moved it. When I looked, the ring was where I had left it. The second click belonged to no object. I put that on the page and drew a line beneath so I'd see it in the morning and not decide that it had belonged to some other day. The inlet wore its fog like a collar and sang low. The 337 with the brake came faint. The choir rail forgot its politeness for a while and did not answer on the rest. The room's own delay didn't play. The bell did not lean, even on the avoided 7th. For the space of a prayer that I refused to make, the church was only wood, air, iron, glass, oil, and a book that had been written in hard by more than one hand. Silence is not absence. It is a kind of full. I lay on the vestry cot with the lamp trimmed low and listened for what wasn't there. The missing things made their own shape. No delayed squeak, no tap at the rail, no inland rhyme growing as I watched, no bell breath at 7 minutes. The clock ticked so evenly that it sounded like an argument I had finally lost. I wrote one last simple line so I would not wake later and add color to a day that had worked so hard to be plain. 2100 to 2300, delays nil, bell neutral, frost hand advances without glint, cove ovals x2, radio quiet, keep notes, do not test. Then I blew the lamp to its blue and let the inlet take up its low talk again, as if it had been waiting out of courtesy. At sleep's edge there came one small sound, not late, not misplaced. The cleat nails squeak on time from the right wall, and a heartbeat after, as if it had been allowed back in by the room itself. The polite tap at the choir rail, learning the beat again. The lull broke at first light with a sound that did not belong to wood or wind. It was the smallest hollow thump, as if somebody had dropped a cork under the floor and it had found its way along joists. The clock, which had behaved like a good sentence all through the night, stood exactly on my wrist time and ticked modestly, neither courting me nor sulking. I logged it plain, 3:28:05:31, clock equals even, bar 29.27 falling, wind ESE with S habit, air 33 deg, low fog in cove, then, floor, subjoist thump x1, location uncertain. The frost handwriting had climbed again, but now, the long-short staggering on both north and south panes had slipped into a repeating clause my tongue wanted to recite. I kept it behind my teeth. The pellets at each pane's base, 3 neat rows, had thickened on the middle line and thinned on the upper, as if there were a preference or a current. The lean toward the belfry stayed faithful. I noted, middle row accretes, upper row thins, pattern stable. I did my round before any testing, checked the stove draft, good, trimmed the lamp wick to an honest oval, walked to the grave plot with the iron key ring in my palm so I had a weight that was mine, brushed rime from the belfry ladder, none new, set the hasp with care. On the third tread of the nave steps, the frost filament had grown back, longer than yesterday, 21 millimeters by my card, still true as a plumb line. I touched it with the knife back. It bowed and did not snap this time. I left it alone and wrote that down because leaving something alone is also a record. Outside, fog hung at shin height and made the churchyard feel shallower. The ovals along the fence had softened, but not lost their count. A fresh run began near the porch post rather than the step, a new habit I did not like. Spacing kept its patience, 42 centimeters, depth only the thickness of a biscuit. They moved toward the cliff, paused, then angled left along the fence where none had gone before. They stopped at the corner where the ground humps, and there a faint arc of salt rime turned inland across two tufts of grass, like a bow drawn backward. I put a knife tip to it and tasted the same light brine that has no business so far above spray. Logged, tracks, route variation, turn left at SW corner, rime, arc inland, faint. The first hollow thump under the floor returned at 0612. It felt more than sounded. A weightless pressure rode the joists from west to east and settled near the front pews. I set the lamp on the center aisle and crouched with my palm on the plank seam. The wood read normal, the cool of spring morning, but my glove felt a pulse that did not travel in wood's usual language. I lifted the glove and put my bare hand down. Cold came up the narrow way a creak says no to a boot. I wrote, subfloor pulse. C062, direction, WE, tempo resembles inlet set, tactile in glove, skin, temp drop local. I went to the vestry to fetch the short-handled brace and the plug cutter, because I knew exactly how far a caretaker is allowed to go before he becomes a carpenter. The floor in the nave has its history of plugs, little round patches where somebody once chased a squeak or a mouse. I would not add to them without cause. Instead, I took the measuring tape and the folding square and made the map a good caretaker makes before he ever lifts a board. Center the aisle, measure from the first pew end to the chancel rail. Tick every joist at 16 inches. Mark the odd spacing where the old priest's bench once stood. Procedure is a fence even when you cannot see the wire. At 0700, the bell offered a short lean and returned as if we had agreed not to trouble each other. The delayed cleat nail squeak had resumed its manners, half-second late, from the choir rail. The yard board gave me east where my boot met it and west where my ear expected it. The church was itself again, which made the new underfloor thump more distinct when it came. 0713, 0720, like tide times in miniature. I braced my hand at each and felt the smallest lift of plank under the second pew on the left, the Brine pew. It lifted not up but inward, as if something under it had swollen, then released. I added, L3 floorboard micro bow at thumps. Lift is inward. I walked to the belfry, not because I thought it belonged there, but because routine keeps me from thinking the wrong size. The clapper leather bore its thin inland rime, smaller today but finer, as if the cold had learned a better hand. The knot under my palm felt cooler than the hatch, which is not how drafts argue. I breathed on it. It kept its frost without glossing. I closed the hasp. Down in the nave I moved to job work to earn my keep. Checked the vestry window hinge, still tight after yesterday's splice, swept the aisle, set blue-taped hymn ledgers along the rail. The Severe Hands book opened by weight to the page with the line I have learned not to chase. Do not sing on the long seventh by habit. Beneath it, pressed indent, no graphite. Another sentence had appeared that I had not put there. When floor speaks, keep the beat off the boards. I wrote it into the index without license. Small letters, floor speaks, keep beat off boards, and drew a line so I wouldn't ask the book to account for itself later. At 0830, I tested the room like a man who can't resist tapping a barometer. I stood in the aisle, did not hum, did not sing, did not set my heel. I counted in my mouth to 7 and rested, then counted to 3 and rested, small and even, as if I were alone in a field. The bell did not lean, the frost strokes did not glint, but the subfloor gave a low, cork-soft thump on my second rest, and the plank at L3 bowed inward a breath. I backed away, ashamed of having asked. I wrote, self-test, silent count, bell nil, windows nil, subfloor answers on rest, do not provoke. The mission radio roused then, the repeater giving the voice its wool. Caretaker bluff? Here, I said. We've got a little water on the store floor, he said, not worried yet. Ice pulling away downriver, you hearing lines? Under the floor, I said before I could dress it in a calmer word. Long pause, then a kind voice like a mittened hand on your shoulder. Keep your list, keep your stove. If the bell is needed, the people will send up a flare. No rope, I said, tired of hearing my own answer. Keep it honest, he returned, because his job requires certain phrases to keep the day from shaking loose, and the line clicked quiet. The rest of the morning the church went dutiful. The prince along the fence did not advance. An east wind came steady with a south whim under it. The frost filaments on the riser lengthened by a hair. I took barometer and read 29:18, with the little needle falling obedient to the sea. At 11:05, the underfloor thump came soft and frequent, 5 and 2 minutes. Like the first small steps people make when they enter late for a service and try to be kind about where they put their feet. I laid my palm to plank near L3 and felt nothing, then to the opposite aisle and felt a faint inward bow, as if the tide had chosen that joist instead. I wrote, load shifts to R aisle, frequency at 11:05. Low at the river mouth was due at 12:11. I put the tide card on the windowsill and held it with the iron key ring. The ring clicked once, the little metal acknowledgement it makes when it decides its own weight. Then I heard that same click from beneath the floor at the rail, a polite shadow of the thing itself. The clock gained a minute between 2 ticks and returned it on the third. I wound one careful turn, not as remedy, but as a way to be counted with. At noon, I let the village have its small comfort. I stood at the rail and spoke the hymn I knew best as a list of tasks rather than a plea. Words plain, measure even. 7th shortened, like a bridge decked with one plank, missing on purpose, so a cart will slow. The bell leaned not at the 7th, but at the rest that followed, 3 seconds, as if to say it would not be taught. The subfloor thumped once on the same rest. The frost strokes brightened, and then went dull together. I kept my hands at my sides and wrote afterward with a steadier hand than I felt. Noon. Spoken hymn, 7th shortened, bell leans on rest, subfloor thump on, same. Windows glint together, do not escalate. By mid-afternoon, the fog dropped into the cove and lifted from the churchyard. The ovals on the water multiplied, 6 now, then 8. Always palm-sized, always patient, and if they formed lines, those lines were ones I refused to measure. The fence boards breathed where the sun touched them. The delayed squeak at the cleat nail arrived from the choir rail, precisely a beat late, as if the room had decided to wear its habits properly when watched. I took a long look at the floor from the back of the nave and saw, with the corner of the eye that carpentry teaches you, that 3 planks near L3 sat almost imperceptibly lower than their neighbors, not warped, not rotten, just agreed upon by weight that was not mine. I made my additions to the anomaly log before dusk so I wouldn't puff them up by lamplight. 15. Subfloor, pulses at 87 mesh cadence, WE, plank at L3 bows, inward at thumps. Later shift to R aisle, frequency 811.05. 16. Windows, pellet mass shifts to middle row, synchronized bright dull responses. 17. Text, new indent line in severe hand. When floor speaks, keep the beat off the boards. 18. Tide correlate, cove ovals, rhyme. Arc inland at SW yard, underfloor click echoes, keyring click. 19. Clock, brief gain return oscillations. Between ticks, I closed the south shutters and left one north pane bare to keep my bad habit in view, set the clock 1 minute slow to make room, and put the iron key ring on the ledger's index so it would hold my day in place. I did not climb to the hatch. The belfry would have to keep itself honest without my palm making a question of it. Evening settled like a coat taken off after too long. The inlet gave its 3 and 3, and the 7 with a break with less vigor, as if the sea were tired of instruction. The choir rail made no tap at first. Then, when I had let myself believe that this would be one of the easy nights, a single very small knock came from under the front pew, polite as a parishioner resettling a hymn book, and the floor answered with a soft, corky thump that did not want to be mistaken for anything urgent. I lay on the vestry cot with the lamp reduced to its blue whisper and held the key ring in my palm to know gravity still meant what it said. The clock ticked, the even grammar a tool earns by minding its work. When the bell leaned at 1914, I felt it in the plank under my boot soles, though I was lying down, the way a person feels a train through the bed, in a town too small for trains. I did not count the rests. I did not hum. I let the measures go past me like drift under a bridge. The last thing before sleep was an odor at the edge of the room that I had not met in days. A clean inner brine, very faint, as if a coat had dried and left its good work behind. I wrote it on the margin in small letters so it would not get ideas about being important. Then I drew a line under the day and saved one square on the page for what the floor might have to say next. Fog pressed low enough to make the church shorter. I woke to the clock keeping my wrist time, and to a faint corky thump under the left front pew, courteous as a cough. I wrote the morning plane first, before the room could argue its case. 3:29:05:33, clock even, bar 29:11 falling, wind ESE steady with S habit, air 34 degrees, fog banked at fence height. Then, because it had the feel of beginning, I added, subfloor thump 0529, L front pew, politeness persists. The frost hand had climbed to shoulder height on the north pane. The 3 pellet rows at the base showed their preference more boldly. Middle row thickened like a tide line, upper row thinned to almost nothing, lower row steady. Long, short staggering continued, cleaner now, and still leaning a degree toward the belfry. On the south pane the same script had caught up, as if 2 scribes had agreed at last. I noted, panes synchronized, bias toward belfry unchanged. The brine-seated L3 had returned with modesty, the kind of clean sea breath a coat keeps after drying in good air. Under my palm, the pew felt cooler than the room by a breath. I put the iron keyring on the pew rail as if to calibrate touch. Iron warmer than wood again. The delayed cleat nail squeak showed up where it should, half a beat late, from the choir rail. And the yardboard answered from the wrong side, then corrected itself with a prim little creak, like a child reciting and catching the line halfway through. Outside, fog hid the village from the bluff, so that smoke was a rumor, not a fact. The fence line wore beads of water, and between the beads a faint dusting of something like salt had settled on 2 posts, the southwest corner and the one beside the porch. I tasted a grain with the knife tip, brine enough to earn the word, though the wind gave no cause. New prints, palm-length ovals, started not from the step or the porch this time, but from the narrow strip beside the south wall, a place where only snowmelt should write. They ran with the same patience, 42 centimeters between, and turned left again at the fence corner, granting the new habit its courtesy, then stopped at the hump with the faint inland rime bow I logged yesterday. I set the folding square across 3 of them, and found the same 5-degree drift toward the south. I wrote, source shift, origin at S wall strip, spacing faithful, drift persists, rime bow reinforced. The first subfloor movement of the day came at 0641, traveling west to east and settling under L3. The plank bowed inward a fraction. When the bell offered its predictable lean at 0642, the floor did not answer. I wrote the lack as carefully as I would a presence. In this work, omission is also a noun. Sundry jobs waited. Lamp wick to a neat oval, stovepipe damper, a thumb-width open, the vestry window hinge to test for yesterday's splice. The grave plots south wedge to seat, a loose hymnal rail screw at pew R2 to snug. I worked the list because lists keep you from building a hall you'll have to live in later. On the vestry west wall, the cold stripe had widened by another finger and climbed by an inch. Still not wet, still that inland chill that makes a kneecap think caution. I pressed my wrist to it and let the watch tell me I was not imagining numbers. I wrote, stripe, +1 up, +1 finger width, temp drop local, subjective chill persists. At 07:35, I brought the blue-taped hymn ledgers to the rail, the severe hands volume on top, because I had stopped pretending I didn't do that on purpose. I opened to my index and found an addition I had not made. When measures travel under the boards, do not give them your feet. The letters were indented, not written, as if pressed by something hard through a blank leaf. My first impulse was to cover it with my palm. Instead, I copied it exactly, small, on the index with a date, then wrote my name after, as the operator said lists with owners behave better. I let the room be a room for a span. The clock went on ticking without showing off. The delayed squeak minded its delay. The bell leaned at 7-minute pace and recovered. The frost handwriting did nothing when I held the lamp near. No pellets jumped. I felt the drift to test with sound and kept my mouth shut. The ledger lay open to my index. I set the iron keyring on it to hold the page. The repeater found me mid-morning. Caretaker bluff? The usual mittened voice, calmer. Here, I said. We've got 3 homes working at the river mouth, he said. No skiffs out. The hums less. He paused, and the pause carried something like embarrassment. Old Sam asked if the bell's your job or the town's. The rope's gone, I said, a sentence too familiar. He knows, the operator said. He just wanted to say his question out loud. Then business returned. Fog lifting some by noon. Keep a look. Keeping, I said. Keep the bell honest, he added, soft, as if the phrase were a blanket he'd decided to let me have without tucking it under my chin. The line went to its woolen quiet. At 1100, an underfloor run came in a different grammar, shorter pulses, closer together. Not the 7-minute tide's patience, but something like footsteps abbreviated to spare the boards. They traveled from the vestry door toward the front pews and then paused beneath the aisle runner. I knelt and felt the runner with my knuckles, the way you check for a loose nail without finding it by accident. No nail. The plank below breathed inward a little to match the pause, then settled. I wrote, subfloor, vestry aisle, abbreviated pulses, pause under runner, inward breath, no sound displaced. So, the room was drawing a map. I drew one too, plan view of nave, pews sketched, L3 marked, arrows for WE pulses and vestry aisle run, dots where the ovals on cove had multiplied, the 5-degree drift at the fence. I made my marks small so the map wouldn't pretend to be more than my hand. Low at the river mouth was due at 12:45. I set the tide card on the windowsill and anchored it with the iron key ring. The ring clicked once in its own metal, and, a second later, a polite answering click came from under the front pew. I did not go to the aisle at once. I stood still and let the answering click find its end by itself. The clock added a half-minute between 2 ticks and gave it back in 1. I wound it a single careful turn to be counted with, then stopped my hand. I don't know if restraint is a procedure, but I wrote it like one. Restraint applied. Lunch was stove bread and tea. I kept the radio near and the ledger nearer. The Severe Hands book lay open at my index again when I looked down, though I had closed it after copying. A new indent line, faint. No one is listening when you strike the long 7th alone. The sentence felt like advice trying to make itself indispensable. I wrote it into the index and then drew a line beneath it so I wouldn't let it arrange my day. At 13:08, the bell did not offer its lean on time. It waited until 13:11 and then leaned twice in quick civility, 2 short inclinations, as if excusing itself for being late. The subfloor pulsed on the rests, not on the leans. The frost strokes on the panes brightened together and then dulled together as they had begun to do. The delayed cleat nail squeak split for one instant into 2 locations, choir rail and west wall, but reconciled by the time I had written the dash. I made the entry plain and left the dash as a reminder not to sand smooth what the day had left rough. Mid-afternoon, the fog broke at the bluff and rolled down into the cove like someone had tipped a basin. The village came into view in pieces: a roof, a porch rail, a dog. Down on the water, the pale ovals had doubled and then arranged themselves without my permission into 2 near-parallel runs that angled from the river seam toward the beach stones. I looked, then looked away, then looked again because pretending not to see is not the same as not seeing. I wrote, cove, ovals arrange into 2 near-parallel runs, angle river beach, do not pace. I did not pace them. The prince at the fence did something untidy for the first time. The line faltered at the corner hump, 2 ovals closer than patience allows, then regained spacing and continued left toward the porch strip, as if something had turned the page back and taken a line again. I measured those crowded 2, 31 centimeters, then 52. I drew a box around the numbers so I would not make a theory. A fox crossed my old diagonal on the lower yard and paused to consider the fence, made its own decision, and vanished toward the switchback. The fence boards creaked their delay half a beat and seemed relieved to perform. Near 4, I went up to the belfry hatch because the question had been waiting on the stair all day. The leather on the clapper still bore its inland rhyme, finer yet. So much so, it looked like dust turned to order. The knot was cool, the hatch warmer, the air among them steady. I put my palm near, not on. Nothing moved. I counted 7 in my mouth and omitted the 7th. The bell leaned not then, but on the small rest between my count and whatever thought was going to follow it. 3 seconds, the bow of a careful neighbor. I closed the hasp gently and stood a moment with my hand on the ladder, feeling the wood decline to answer any more questions. I thanked it in the way a person thanks a tool. I left it alone. Evening wanted its shutters. I left one north pane open because habit becomes a form of witness, whether you mean it to or not. The frost hand had reached where an ordinary person looks when listening. The pellets on the middle row had swollen into beads that caught the lamp and made a string of small lights the eye wanted to follow. I put the lamp down so the string would not become anything more than a string. The radio called once more. Caretaker, the voice softer. We've got one flare east side. Gulls spooked it. No help needed. Folks asked me to pass a thing. I waited. They said a bell that isn't rung still counts. You know what they mean. I'm counting, I said. I'll keep the ledger. He let breath out through the repeater. Good enough, he said. Fog's off. Be neighborly. The line gave me its mittened hush. I added to the log before the lamp went low, while the facts were facts and not braver. 20. Ledger. New indent lines. When measures travel under the boards, do not give them your feet. No one is listening when you strike the long seventh alone. A 21. Subfloor. Vestry aisle, abbreviated pulses. Polite pauses, no upward bow, inward only. Echo click coincides with keyring. 22. Fence, prints, source shift to S wall strip, corner spacing anomaly. 3152 SME, drift persists. 23. Cove. Ovals in 2 near parallel runs, angled river beach. 24. Bell. Mist, 1307 lean, double short lean, 1311, evening lean on rest after counted omission. 25. Stripe. Vestry, W wall climbs, +1, widens, +1 finger. East step by 1 finger. I set the wind-up clock 1 minute slow to make room the way I do. Wound it a single plane turn, put the iron keyring on the index page where the new lines sat, and blew the lamp toward its steady blue. The inlet found its grammar again. 3, 3, that long seventh that breaks. And under the front pew, the polite corky thump answered only on the breaks, as if learning, as if practicing not to step on the boards while I listened. Somewhere between the 6th and the thing I will not call the 7th, the ledger's page, held by the keyring, shifted a fraction. When I reached to square it, the indented letters showed a new faint stroke near their end. Not a sentence, only a mark. A pressed line as straight as the frost filaments on the riser. I didn't copy it. I drew a small box where words would go and closed the book with my palm flat, as if closing a hatch against a polite weather. I lay on the vestry cot and let the room breathe. The bell did not lean on the hour. The clock did not show off. The boards under L3 took a slow inward breath and gave it back without asking me to agree. I counted nothing, spoke nothing, and kept my hands out of the measure. When sleep came, it came the way fog leaves a cove, taking its time, making the shore look closer. The last sound was the cleat nails squeak. Wrong wall first, right wall second, then, very small, the echo click from under the rail, like a new hand finding where to put itself on the ledger without tearing the paper. Fog lifted enough to show the village roofs like cards laid face down. The clock stood even at first glance, and then, while my eyes were on it, added a minute between ticks with a softness that made me think I'd imagined it. I set my own wrist back against the face and let the minute pass without touching the key. Ledger first, before it could pretend to be a thought. 3:30, 0534, clock +1, gained intra-tick, left uncorrected, BR 2902 falling. Wind, ESE steady, we says pull, air 35 dig, cloud deck thin, cove gray-black. Subfloor thump, 0531, polite. Windows writing higher, review. The frost handwriting had crept above eye level. The 3 pellet rows at each pane's base showed that preference that has stopped being a coincidence. Middle row thick like a cord, lower row steady, upper row thinning to clean glass. The long short staggering now nested. Short groups inside long, as if a smaller hand were writing on the back of a larger. Each stroke still leaned a degree toward the belfry. I brought the lamp close. Nothing jumped. The facets brightened together, dimmed together. I logged it plain, then shut the lamp lid so I wouldn't keep asking. The brine seated L3 was a whisper again, cleaner than low tide, like rope that has been rinsed and hung. Under my palm, the pew stayed cooler than the air by that reliable breath. I pressed the iron keyring to the rail. It felt warmer than the wood again, the small comfort of a tool agreeing with itself. The cleat nail squeak answered half a beat late from the choir rail, loyal now, almost cheerful in its obedience. Outside, a mild south habit rode under the east. The fence beads carried a dust of salt on the southwest corner again, and, new, a fine grit on the post near the vestry window. I tasted a grain on the knife tip, brine enough to write. Fresh ovals, palm long, began as they had yesterday at the narrow strip beside the south wall. They ran with their faithful spacing, 42 centimeters, turned left at the corner hump, and then did something I had not yet seen in daylight. They paused twice, 2 ovals close, 30 and 52 again, and then crossed my own boot line as if I had been the one to leave a record too neat not to step on. At the cliff edge, they did not stop. They drew a short arc to the right, and then ended at the lip, as if the ground had changed its mind beneath them. I stood with the staff planted and did not lean out. Procedure can be restraint. Inside, the subfloor spoke at 0612 and 0619, west to east, inward breath under L3, like tide but closer and lighter. The bell did not lean on either. I wrote lack as noun again, and underlined restraint twice so I wouldn't congratulate myself later. Sundry kept me proper. Lamp wick to a clean oval, stovepipe damper thumb width, grave plot wedge tight, vestry hinge greased with the same stub of wax I use on trapdoors. On the vestry west wall, the cold stripe climbed another inch. I pressed my wrist to it and felt the watch go honest, and the bone behind it notice a weather that had not been announced yet. I made the entry small. Stripe +1, temp drop local, subjective ache in wrist, ignore unless persists. At 0707, the clock added 2 minutes between ticks and didn't return them. It made the minute long, then longer. I set the ledger open, took the key, and did not wind, because not winding is also a choice you can test. The bell leaned late, 0711, 2 short nods like yesterday's apology. Under the floor, I felt a small run of courteous pulses from vestry toward aisle, abbreviated careful. I knelt and put my knuckles to the aisle runner. No loose nail. Inward bow, not up. I wrote, clock gains persist, leave uncorrected to observe, bell late, double short, subfloor vestry aisle repeats, keep feet light. It was Sunday by old habit, but not on the card. I set the blue-taped hymn ledgers on the rail anyway, severe hand on top. The book opened to my index. A new indent sentence lay near the bottom, faint but deliberate. When minutes go long, do not hurry them back. I copied it exactly, added date and initials like I'd been told lists behave better with owners, and drew a line so I wouldn't let it rule the day. The repeater found me at Yalfamfine. Caretaker Bluff? The voice softer, smoke warmed. Here, I said. River mouth is peeling clean, he said. 2 skiffs thinking about it and thinking better. Fog's off. Old Sam says he's hearing the line sing west again, not like power. I'm hearing something under the boards, I said, intending to make it smaller and failing. He exhaled wool. Keep the stove, keep the list. If anyone needs the bell, they'll send a flare. I know, I said. Keep it honest, he said, but this time it sounded like he gave the words to the day rather than to me. At Euro 900, the frost filaments on the second tread had grown to 24 millimeters, and one hair had gently curved toward the aisle, a bowstring finding a direction. I touched the back of the knife to it. It bent and stayed. Leaving things be is a practice. I wrote leaving be as if I could check it off. A caretaker is supposed to be kind to clocks, even when they behave badly. At 0932, the wind-up added a minute in one step with a soft internal click, then took half a minute back in 3 ticks and kept walking as if it had washed its face and returned to table. I set the key into the winding arbor, felt the spring's reserve against my fingers, and gave it one courteous turn only, not to correct, but to say I was here. The iron keyring clicked a small reply on the ledger's index where I'd left it holding the page. The same click, an instant later, came polite and hollow from beneath the front pew. I made no movement, just wrote echo click below, underlined once, and changed nothing. By late morning, the cove drew its pale ovals into 3 near parallel runs, angled from the river seam toward our stones. I looked and did not count. The fence looked like a staff and the prints like notes I refused to sing, which is a sentence I will not give my ledger. I replaced it with this. Cove, ovals x3 runs, maintain distance. Low at the river mouth came 1258 by the card that has never lied to me. I set it on the windowsill and gave it the iron keyring like a weight of consent. The bell missed its 7-minute lean and found it late again, 1302. One long breath that finished in a short catch like surprise. The subfloor answered not on the long, but on the catch, one cork-soft thump, then went polite again. The frost handwriting brightened in a small way and dulled together. The cleat nail squeak split and reconciled. I wrote all of it without favor, and every noun I chose was the plainest possible. I had an errand that felt like honesty. The roof seam at the south gutter wanted eyes, and the louver on the belfry's inland side had been carrying its fine rhyme ring too many days. I slung the rope, set the cleats, and climbed. The wind's south habit lay on the face and made the cedar boards feel like paper under a soft palm. The inland louver edge showed its frost, finer still, not rime now, but a dust that arranged itself into neat, short strokes like the window's writing, each stroke leaning imperceptibly toward the bell within. I breathed on one stroke. It did not gloss. I brushed my glove lightly across and watched 3 strokes lift as if they had been held to their work by attention alone. Beneath, the wood felt ordinary. I put the glove back on the rung and left the louver to its assignments. From the roofline, the village was a story spoken through mittened hands. 2 gulls hung over the river seam and then shot inland, making those quick course corrections gulls make when they catch an upwash from something not wind. Their bodies wrote a 337 without knowing it. I refused it the satisfaction of words. Back on the floor, it was time to do a job I had been waiting to do until the habit could stop pretending it was caution. The plank under L3, one of the old cedar runs with round plugs from a repair that predates me, had the slightest rake at the seam. I chalked 2 joist lines at 16-inch centers and set the folding square so the plank's edge would be honest if I had to lift it someday. I did not lift it. I only drew the chalk lines and wrote, "Map made for later if needed. Tools returned to hook." Because drawing a map is a way to promise yourself you'll be reasonable when fear gives you fast hands. The ledger wanted attention as a dog wants the couch. The severe hand's volume, left closed on the rail, had shifted half a finger toward the aisle. I placed it back with the spine square and the keyring atop, a deliberate weight. Indented near the bottom margin where my index lay, a new short line had been pressed, not a sentence, only 3 small dashes and 1 long, the same pressed grammar I'd seen on the windows and the riser and in the flights of gulls when they had not been paying attention to me. I did not copy dashes. I drew a small empty box instead and dated the page so I wouldn't give the absence more ideas. Mid-afternoon, the clock made a show, added 3 minutes in the span it takes the stove to pop as a knot gives up its ghost. The tick amplitude rose in my ear though the case had not been opened. I let it stand. I marked it. +3 at 15:17, unadjusted. The underfloor pulses went quiet for a stretch, as if someone had put a palm up to say, "Not now." The yard boards gave their proper creaks. The cleat nail squeak minded its count. The frost hand rose a little. The cove ovals held their 3 runs without multiplying. Quiet is also pattern. Evening made a pale coin at the horizon and left it there. The village radio came at 1700 with its wool. "Caretaker, you keeping?" "Keeping," I said. "We may try the skiff tomorrow if a seam holds," he said. Then, after a pause, we heard one long note from the west, like a line a boy drags his hand on. "Could be nothing." "Could be," I said, and put my hand on the ledger so the page would not pretend to float. "Keep the bell honest," he added, almost shy of the phrase now. "I'm keeping the list," I said. "That too." Dusk gave the belfry hatch its usual argument. I did not climb. I set shutters on the south windows and left one north bare, the way I do when I want to call a habit by its right name. I set the clock 1 minute slow to make room for the night to fit inside it, and did not touch the key. The clock gained a minute between ticks in the time it took me to lower my hand. I wrote Gaines' room quickly, then crossed the words out once so they wouldn't become verse. The day wanted its last entry, so I walked the aisle with the lamp low and did not test with sound. The frost handwriting shimmered together once as the lamp's wick found its quiet. Under the front pew, the polite corky thump came on the break between the inlets 3-3 and the 2 long 7th. The bell leaned 1 long breath, not at the 7th, but on the small rest after, as if keeping me from finishing a thing I didn't want to start. I added to the log in plain nouns while the lamp still behaved. 26, clock. Intra-tick gains. +1, +2, +3. Partial give back, leaving uncorrected per ledger guidance. 27. Windows louver, inland louver, strokes mimic pane hand. Dust-like, non-gloss to breath, 3 strokes lifted to glove. 28. Prints, origin at S wall, corner pauses, 31 smear 52 nindusum, recur. Arc at cliff lip, crossing of caretaker boot line. 29. Subfloor, pulses continue at rests. Vestry aisle abbreviated runs. WE tide-like at morning, polite intervals. 30. Ledger, indent, when minutes go long, do not hurry them back. New pressed marks, dim, without graphite. 31. Stripe, vestry, wall climbs, wrist ache subjective, monitor, I placed the iron key ring on the index to weigh the newer lines and blew the lamp down to its blue. The inlet spoke its grammar with less muscle. 3, 3, 7 that breaks. And in the room, the delays came back on time, like a choir taking their places after a cough. The clock ticked in a voice that had learned a new room. I lay on the vestry cot and did not count. The boards under L3 took their small inward breath and returned it. The cleat nail squeaked from the right wall, then the wrong, then the right again, practicing until it could do both, without apology. On the windows, the middle pellet row shone as if someone had laid a string of beads there, so I would not mistake where the line lived tonight. Sleep came, careful and late. In the thin space between waking and whatever polite hour waited on the other side, I heard a single hollow click from beneath the altar shelf where the clock sits, the sound of a key settling into a lock that no one had set. The clock did not chime. The bell did not lean. The room held its breath as if to show me what it meant by measure when it didn't need me to keep it. The night had left the clock where I'd asked it to be, 1 minute slow. And then, in the time it took to breathe and stand, it added that minute back with the soft internal assent I'd learned not to argue with. Ledger first, 3:31, 05:35, clock +1, intra-tick. Accepted, BAR 28.96 falling, wind ESC with steady S pull, air 36 degrees, low ceiling but brighter, fog off the fence line, cove, darker water showing, subfloor, polite, thump 0532 under L front pew, windows writing persists. The frost handwriting had climbed into the upper panes. The 3 pellet rows at the bases looked fixed now, lower steady, middle thick as a bead string, upper nearly gone. The long short staggering had nested into itself, small clauses riding larger ones, and each stroke still leaned a degree toward the belfry, like a congregation turning to the lectern. When I brought the lamp close, the facets brightened together, then dimmed together, neither jumping nor smearing. I wrote it without making it clever. The Brine seated L3 returned like a cleaned rope, faint, honest. Under my palm, the pew kept its breath of cool longer than my hand could shorten it. The cleat nail squeak arrived where it should, half beat late, from the choir rail. The yarda board answered wrong wall, right wall, then behaved, pleased with itself for remembering the order. Outside, the thaw spoke in quiet ways that workmen notice. The snow line had pulled back from the south wall a palm's width, leaving that narrow strip of damp gravel where melt collects before choosing a direction. Ovals, palm-long, faithful 42 centimeters, began there again, then took their now practiced left at the fence corner. At the hump they crowded briefly, 31 centimeters, then 52, before resuming their patience toward the porch strip. They ended with an arc at the cliff lip, drawn rightward, a handful of degrees, as if a hand had reconsidered mid-gesture. On the southwest corner post, a dusting of salt showed in a thin crescent, inland-facing, knife-tip taste, brine enough to name. Low sounds worked up from the cove just before 6, a belly thud under ice gone thin. The subfloor answered with a west to east pulse that made the plank at L3 bow inward, a breath, and then settle. The bell did not lean. I wrote lack as noun and left the space after it blank. Sundry first, lamp wick to a neat oval, stovepipe damper, a thumb width, ash pan emptied to the steel bucket, grave plot wedges tamped, vestry hinge given a turn of wax. On the vestry west wall, the cold stripe had climbed 2 fingers and broadened so that my wrist could find it without looking. Still not wet, still that inland chill that makes a bone think river. Stripe +2, fingers up, +1 finger wide, temp drop local, subjective ache persists. The belfry steps asked for care. Overnight thaw and day chill raise fur on wood. The rime I'd scraped a week ago grows back shy. I took the knife back and a rag and went up with the lamp slow so the breath of it wouldn't write more frost than my hand could wipe. On the third tread, the frost filament I'd spared yesterday had lengthened and bowed slightly toward the aisle below, as if listening. I left it a second day. You can overmanage a room and make it clever. At the hatch I felt a different cold, not the outdoor kind. The air inside the belfry had a cool that isn't draft. Cellar cool, dry and careful. The leather knot that buffers the clapper still wore its inland dust. No longer a fur, not wet. Strokes as fine and short as the window's handwriting. I set my palm close and counted in my mouth without giving the count a shape. Nothing moved. When I unlatched and lifted, a line of damp appeared along the underside of the hatch lid. Beads small and evenly spaced, as if a hand had laid them out with a ruler along the cross brace. A breath later, one bead let go and fell back up, lifted clean to the lid instead of dripping to the floor. I let the lid rest on my shoulder and watched. Another formed on the brace. It did not fall. A third joined it, and then, as if the room preferred tidiness, all three slid together a finger's width along the brace and sat exactly above the clapper's leather. My throat did a fool's dry swallow. I wrote with the pencil nub I keep in my shirt. Belfry. Beads form underside hatch. Slide laterally to clapper line. No drip downward. Motion deliberate. Time, 0644. I shut the hatch with the care you use on a sleeping child and set the hasp. Back on the nave floor, the delayed cleat nail squeak answered punctually. The clock added half a minute and gave it back in 3 ticks. I did not touch the key. Restraint applied. The subfloor thumped courtesy under the front pew once on the rest, between the inlets 3-3 and whatever comes after that. The inlet itself had picked up its grammar, dark water showing in the lead by the river mouth, 3 gulls writing pilots across it. The repeater found me at 0715, the voice warmer than the air. Caretaker Bluff? Here. We've got 2 skiffs thinking up river mouth at midday if the seam holds. Folks asked me to tell you they don't need a bell unless somebody says so. That's the message. It sounded like someone had argued before deciding to send it. Understood, I said. Any hum west? Less, he said. More small noises. Lines on rock, maybe. Ice talking like it's learned manners. He left the line open half a beat. Keep the stove. The phrase meant what it meant. At 8, I did the kindness you offer a house that keeps your hours. I swept the aisle, wiped the rails, set blue-taped ledgers on the front bench. Severe hand on top, because the hand had won the right to sit there. The book opened by weight to my index. A new indent sentence, pressed, not written, had appeared low on the page, tight letters in the hand. I refused to call a person's. When water climbs, do not follow it up. I copied it exactly, added date and initials, drew a line beneath so it would be a line and not a door. I did not look up at the hatch while I did the copying. I let the sentence stand on the paper alone. By mid-morning, thaw had made the roof speak. Tiny ticks as shingles released their hold on frost. I slung the rope, set the cleats, and climbed. The south gutter carried a small shine, moving honest. At the belfry louvers, inside face, the dust strokes had lengthened by a hair, each leaning that same patient degree toward the bell. On the inland louver brace, a short wet line had formed where the dry dust refused wetness. One clear bead hung at the end of the line, not falling. When the wind breathed through, the bead slid up a half inch, then settled. I wrote the fact and not the feeling. Louver. Bead slides upward, 0.5 on wind, returns, no drip. From the roofline, the village showed itself in pieces as the ceiling thinned. Porch rails, a boy's red cap, a blue tarp bright like something new. The river mouth seam moved with confidence. 2 skiffs lay angled on the beach, owners talking with hands. Down on the cove, the pale ovals, my near parallel runs, pulled closer to our stones, then held. I did not count them. I marked their position against the spruce stump and the big rock that looks like a seal when you want one, and climbed down to earn my bread. The subfloor picked up at 10:49, this time in a little procession. 3 polite pulses from vestry toward aisle, a pause under the runner, 1 soft inward bow beneath L3, and a hollow echo click near the rail that came a beat after the iron key ring clicked on the ledger where I'd moved it to keep a page flat. The bell offered nothing then. The clock stood even. I wrote the order down like steps in a service. VA pulses X3, pause, L3 inward, rail echo click, bell nil, clock even. Low at the river mouth was due 13:41. It would be a skiff day if nobody changed his mind. I ate stove bread and watched the brights and dulls in the window facets come and go in small agreements. The delayed cleat nail squeak split and reconciled. Choir rail first, west wall next, then both together, and then neither for a beat that felt like somebody waiting at a door. I did not open any doors. Near noon, the first true melt drip in the nave announced itself. A clean note from somewhere above the chancel that did not match the roof map I know. I took the lamp and knelt at the rail to watch for a wet mark on the floorboards. None. Another drip sounded, to my right this time, then, a breath later, left. The lamp showed no water. The sound arrived not where the wet would have been, but where the room wanted it. A delayed placed drip that made a map of where a drip should tell the truth. I wrote nave, drip sounds in air, no wet, positions drift, delay. E.7s from visual expectation, do not chase. I climbed to the attic crawl because the cost of not looking would be dearer. The cedar underside above the chancel carried no wet. Above L3, the brine pew, the fine salt rows had grown into a neat ladder, rungs biasing belfry-ward the same degree as the window strokes. Between two rungs, a single clear bead clung and refused to fall, quivering as if holding the rest of a measure. I cut a little square of paper from a hymnal flyleaf and set it beneath where a bead would fall if it had any respect for gravity. I waited. The bead lifted a hair, settled, then slid along the rung to the side and stayed. Paper stayed dry. I backed out slow so I wouldn't add more to write than I could carry. Down on the floor, the radio gave me the skiff men in mittened phrases. We're taking her out at 1:45 if the seam proves. Don't ring us unless the river says so. You got eyes on the cliff? On it, I said. Bell stays honest by staying quiet. That's the kind, the operator said. And I heard a man in the back say something like a joke, and then swallow it. At 13:12, the bell missed its 7-minute lean, and then offered 2 short nods in the space I had begun to expect one. The subfloor pulsed on the small rest after, inward under L3, and then under the right aisle, as if the room were practicing generosity. The clock gained 2 minutes between ticks and kept them. I did not wind. I set it 1 minute slow to make the same old room, and it took the room back in a breath. Ledger entry, bell late, double short, floor answers on rest, clock +2 holds, reset 1 to preserve room, accepted. At 13:41, the river kept its appointment. The cove showed darker water, and the skiff slid, reluctant and then loud, across a skin that decided to be water again. The owners worked their hands into their sleeves the way men do when both prudence and pride have a say. I walked to the fence and stood by the hump. The ovals at the cliff lip had written a short swerve right and then stopped right where ground becomes not ground, the thin grass showing a rainbow inland. I did not lean out. I looked left instead, at the south wall strip where the day's first prints had begun. Fresh ovals had formed there while I had been doing honest work, palm-long, faithful spacing, and for the first time they crossed my boot line in 2 directions at once, like a person stepping over a hose without looking down. My mouth made a small sound I did not write. Inside, I gave the house its noon kindness. I stood at the rail and spoke, not sang, the shortest hymn in the ledger, cut the 7th small, let rests be rests. The bell did nothing where I thought it would. On the little rest after, it leaned a careful 3 seconds and returned. Under the floor, a cork-soft thump answered, not under L3 this time, but under the right front pew as if to say, "We have learned your map." The clock held steady. The delayed squeak minded its manners. The drip sounds did not play their trick. Mid-afternoon, the first true wet showed where it should. A single dark grain on the nave floor, 2 boards forward of the rail. So small you could mistake it for a sand flea if churches had such guests. I touched it with the corner of a folded card. The card took no water. The grain rose onto the card as if magneted and left a dry, clean board behind. On the card, between 2 ruled lines where I had meant to list stove splits, the grain rolled to the left margin and stopped, making a period under a sentence that had not been written yet. I set the card on the rail and weighted it with the iron key ring. The ring clicked once, and from beneath the rail came the polite answering click that does not belong to metal. I let it be. The belfry called me without asking. I climbed slow, lamp low, knife back in my pocket to feel like a caretaker and not a boy investigating. The hatch underside now showed a regular ladder of beads along the brace. 8, then a gap, then 3 close. None fell. When the wind breathed through, the 3 slid together toward the clapper line and held. The leather knot wore its dry strokes like a hymn margin. I did not count them. I laid my palm near the clapper, not touching, and kept my shoulders square. A small cool brushed my skin, the kind of cool an open cellar gives when a door is cracked. The bell offered a nod then, not at a time I knew. A courtesy bow toward the hatch and back. The ladder of beads trembled at once and stilled. I wrote, belfry. Ladder beads tremble together on nod. Remain, no drip, counted, and left the question mark untended. Toward dusk, the skiffs returned with men inside them, who had made decisions they could keep. The village voice on the repeater carried bread in it. "Home," he said. "No one asked for a bell. Tell your house thank you." "I will," I said, and the line closed like a book. Evening wanted shutters. I left one north pane bare, as I do, because a habit kept in sight can be told the truth to. The frost handwriting had slowed, as if the upper margin of the pane asked for softer steps. The middle pellet row shone in the lamp, beads bright and then dull together. The delayed squeak split once, reconciled, and did not change its mind again. The subfloor pulsed only on rests. The vestry wall stripe climbed a finger in the hour without my wrist against it. I wrote all of that and nothing else. Before I set the lamp to its blue, I added to the anomaly log in nouns small enough to carry. Belfry. Beads form underside hatch, slide lateral to clapper line, tremble together on bell nod, no downward drip observed. Nave. Drip sounds absent of wet, positions drift, delays, 0.7s, later single grain lifts onto card and rolls left, leaves board dry. Prints begin at S wall, crowd 3152 SME at corner, arc at cliff, two-direction crossing of caretaker boot line, rhyme bow inland persists. Subfloor, procession, VA X3, pause, L3 inward, rail echo click, later response migrates to R front. Clock, +1, +2 gains hold selectively, accepts one room, somar, room, intra-tick adjustments, routine. Louver, dust strokes lengthen, a single bead slides upward with wind, returns, no drip. Stripe, vestry, woo wall rises, broadens, temp drop local, subjective ache persists. I set the wind up 1 minute slow to make room. The clock held the room and did not take it back. I put the iron keyring on the index page where the new line sat. When water climbs, do not follow it up, and pressed my palm there a moment longer than was needed. Then I blew the lamp to its blue and lay on the vestry cot with the house counting in its modest voice. Stove ticks, clock grammar, the inlet's 3-3, and that long thought that breaks. Before sleep, the bell gave a single nod on a rest that had not belonged to any of my measures. Under the front pew, the polite corky thump answered, and above my face, I heard the softest pat of something finding the hatch and sticking there instead of falling. I did not count. I did not follow the water up. I let the room keep its own beat and promised myself I would keep my feet off the boards if they asked me. By afternoon, the barometer needle made its mind a slope. I wrote it without embroidery because the numbers had already done the talking. 4-1, 15-10, bar 28.72 and falling fast. Wind, SE building with S pull, air 37 degrees, ceiling pressed low, tide card unchanged, river mouth seam confident. Clock behavior mixed. +1 intra-tick at 1441, gave back half, left uncorrected. The frost hand on the north pane had reached the upper sash and begun to write across it sideways, short strokes marching east, still leaning that patient degree toward the belfry. The middle pellet row at the base shone with a constant small brightness, like a string held taut. On the south, the same script followed a beat behind, catching up whenever cloud thinned. I put the lamp near and watched the facets brighten together, dim together, the way they have learned to do when they want me to be a recorder and not a witness. I wrote facets obedient, restraint applied, and set the lamp down. A low smell got into the room with the first true gust. Not brine, not iron, but the turned earth cold you meet at the bottom of a root cellar. It sat near the chancel rail and waited like a good guest who has been told to arrive 15 minutes late. Under my palm, the third left pew kept its cooler than air by a breath. The cleat nail squeak minded its half-beat delay from the choir rail, then, once, spoke from both rail and west wall at once and felt pleased to have managed it. I gave it a single underlined line. Squeak split reconciled. Room pleased with itself. Subjective. Strike later. Outside, the fence wore beads so fat they couldn't choose between water and glass. The ovals along the south wall strip began as always, palm long, spacing faithful at 42 centimeters, and turned left at the corner hump where they crowded tradition into 31 and 52, then resumed along the fence. At the cliff, their day habit altered. Instead of one neat rightward arc, a tighter swerve hooked left, then stopped where grass thinned and rime bowed inland. Knife tip taste, brine enough. Wind pressed the fog down into the cove and dragged the sound of thudding ice into the churchyard like a rolled log. I did job work in a hurry that was not panic. Gutter check, stove fed, vestry hinge waxed, grave wedges tamped, cleats hung where they could be found in the dark. On the vestry west wall, the cold stripe had climbed another 2 fingers and widened past a hand. My wrist bone found it before the watch did. I wrote, stripe +2, fingers up, width, palm, temp, drop local, ache steady. At 16:17, the first hollow underfloor procession came in fast talk. Vestry toward aisle in 5 polite pulses. Pause beneath the runner, small inward bow under L3, and, new, an echo click from beneath the altar shelf, as if the shelf had grown a hinge. The bell did not lean then. The wind-up clock added 2 minutes between ticks and kept both with a little shameful pride audible in the amplitude. I did not wind. I set it 1 minute slow to make the same old room and wrote acceptance immediate. The repeater's mitten voice brought town at 1700. Caretaker bluff, skiffs grounded, seam jittery, wind going south for breeding. It's the sort of phrase a coastman will use when he needs to put weather in a place you can nod at. You need the bell? I asked. Ritual more than question. No bell, he said. Not unless someone says so. Lines west, humming steady. Could be power, could be ice, could be. And here he let the word lose shape. Keep the stove, be neighborly. I said I would, and did not ask him to be careful, because nobody needs to be told a thing he cannot choose. By dusk, the ceiling pressed down like a hand. The belfry louvers wore their dust strokes on the inside face. Along the inland brace, a chain of clear beads had gathered with mathematical patience. 8, gap, 3, my same hateful arithmetic showing up in the places where water ought only to fall. I went up with the lamp low and the knife back in my pocket to keep my hands honest. At the hatch underside, the beads were already arranged in a ladder above the clapper line. When the wind breathed, the ladder trembled together, slid a half-inch, then held. No drip. I wrote, hatch beads migrate in wind toward clapper line. Tremble together, no fall, 1831, and closed the hasp like I was tucking in a child I didn't dare name. Evening needed shutters. I barred the south, left one north pane bare to keep habit where I could see it misbehave. I set the wind-up clock 1 minute slow. It took the room as if grateful for the space. I put the iron keyring on the severe hands ledger to weigh the index where I'd recopied every pressed line that had arrived over the last days. When I opened to log, a new indent waited at the bottom margin in that same tight hand. When pressure falls, do not keep time for it. I copied it exactly, added date and my initials to own it, drew a line under to keep it from arranging the night. Then I gave the room its one small kindness. At 1900, off the card but on the clock, I stood at the rail and spoke a hymn without the 7th, plain voice, even measure, hands at my sides. The bell did not lean where the omission lived. On the rest after, it leaned 3 seconds and returned, a neighbor at the fence offering his head so you know he has heard. Beneath the floor, a quirky thump answered under the right front pew, not L3, as if the room were taking turns. The delayed squeak arrived on time from the choir rail, while my ear heard it late from the west wall. I wrote the mismatch and refused to call it more than a delay. Low pressure at night makes a building try on someone else's voice. The stove ticked after each breath like a careful cough. The panes sang a small bright tone when the wind shouldered the east side. The clock, which had behaved, gave itself 3 minutes at 1949 and, without apology, kept them. I let it. A caretaker can choose not to fix and still remain a caretaker. I wrote, clock +3 at 1949, amplitude, left alone per guidance. The first underfloor run of the night weather came at 2006, west to east, then vestry to aisle, then a pause under the runner that lasted the length of a long breath. The kind you use when you've put a heavy thing down and want to be polite about saying you did. The plank at L3 bowed inward a fraction, released, and the polite echo click answered from beneath the rail, as if the iron keyring had moved, though it lay on the ledger where I'd left it. I put my knuckles to the runner and felt the floor's answer in the glove more than the skin. I wrote the order down like a litany I was learning for a service I'd never be asked to lead. At 2031, the belfry hatch gave a sound that was not a sound, the sense of wet gathering where wet ought not, then sliding along a brace to the clapper line as if drawn. I did not go up. I went to the north pane and watched the middle pellet row shine the way a string does when someone plucks it and lets it do the rest. The facets brightened together, dimmed together. The frost strokes on the upper sash, writing east, paused and then continued as if taking their own small breath. The village voice returned it to 100, the wool heavier. Pressure down to 68, he said without units, because the needle speaks in habit, not math. No skiffs. One house wants to know if you'll ring for the 9 o'clock, just in case. He made the case small with his mouth. No rope, I said, but we both knew that wasn't the answer. Keep it honest by keeping it, he said. Then, soft, so nobody else could call it church. Count for them if you can. I'll keep the list, I said. The line went to hush. After the call, I set out the blue-taped hymn ledgers on the front bench, as if keeping house for a congregation that had promised to be good. I placed the Severe Hands volume on top and watched the indented letters settle into themselves. A pressed mark near the margin, new, a long dash with 2 short under it, like a bar and feet. I boxed it and did not copy the shape. The iron keyring, warming to the room, clicked once on the cover. The echo click answered from beneath the altar shelf where the clock sits. The clock ticked louder one instant, then softer as if embarrassed. Wind pressed a hand along the south wall. The ovals at the cliff lip wrote that tight leftward swerve again and stopped short. Down in the cove, the pale runs angled river to stones and held their 3-run grammar. With the lamp hooded, the nave made drip sounds in 3 places and left no wet. I held the lamp to the floor 2 boards in from the rail. A single dark grain appeared where there had been none, rolled toward the left margin of a card I'd left there hours ago, stopped at the ruled line exactly, and sat like a period waiting for sentence. I covered the card with my palm. The grain did not press moisture into my skin. I wrote, "Grain obeys ruled margin, no wet, behaves like punctuation, do not interpret. A house will ask you outright if you are the one who keeps it." The first honest question came just before 2200 when the bell leaned on a rest. It had no right to own and held 5 seconds, longer than its habit, then returned the exact distance we both could stand. Beneath the floor, a soft cork thump answered from under the center aisle, not left, not right. The vestry stripe cooled another inch up the wall in the same minute. The clock gained 1 and returned it at once, as if practicing civility. The delayed squeak from the cleat nail arrived with its proper half-beat, from both places at once and then nowhere at all. The window's facets dimmed together like a congregation deciding to kneel. I wrote all of it before it could decide to become more. At 22:37, I allowed myself up the belfry steps, because not going would have been another kind of superstition. The frost filament on the 3rd tread had curved further toward the aisle below, a hair bowstring gone over to intention. I left it again. At the hatch, the bead ladder trembled all at once and slid a finger toward the clapper line as wind pressed, then, not falling, settled where the leather's dry strokes already pointed. I set my palm near the clapper and counted in my mouth, even, without giving the 7th more weight than any other. On the small rest after the count, the bell offered a careful nod, and from the dark of the nave a single polite tap answered at the choir rail, as if the room had found its manners again. I came down and set the lamp low. I set the wind-up clock 1 minute slow, because making room is the only comfort I own. It took the room and kept it. I put the iron keyring on the ledger to weigh the pressed line. When pressure falls, do not keep time for it, and pressed my palm there until I could name my hand again. Then I lay on the vestry cot, with the house saying what it had chosen. Stove's careful cough, the inlet's 3, 3, and that long thought with the break. The quiet answer from under the floor, only on rests. Near midnight, when the needle had fallen as far as it meant to and was thinking about rising, a soft pat found the hatch and stuck instead of falling. And from beneath the altar shelf, a hollow click sounded like a key settling into a lock that nobody had set. The clock did not chime. The bell did not lean. In the quiet that followed, the choir rail gave one small tap on a rest I had not counted for it. I wrote the last line of the night small so the room wouldn't feel admired. Pressure low holds. House keeps its own beat. Caretaker to keep feet off boards. Then I drew a plain box for tomorrow and left it empty. The pressure bottomed and held like a weight set on a table to remind it to be steady. Morning did not rise so much as lift a corner. I logged the numbers first so my hand would know its work. 42054 bar 28. 72 steady, wind S with east habit in gusts. Air 36 degrees, ceiling thin, cove, dark water sure. Clock, even at first glance, added pull 1 intra tick while I watched, left uncorrected. The windows had written to the top sash now. Across the upper glass, the short strokes still marched east, each one leaning that patient degree toward the belfry. At the bases, the 3 pellet rows looked settled into their roles, lower steady, middle bright as a string held taut. upper almost gone. The facets brightened together, dimmed together. No jumping, no smear. I wrote it plain and set the lamp down because the lamp had learned to make things clever. The brine-seated L3 returned like a memory that had been trying not to intrude. Under my palm, the pew kept its cooler than air by a breath longer than touch can explain. The cleat nail squeak minded its half-beat delay from the choir rail, then, once, chose the west wall and corrected itself as if embarrassed. Outside, ovals began once more at the narrow strip beside the south wall, patient 42 centimeters. At the fence corner, they crowded to 31 and 52 like a habit owning up to itself. At the cliff, they rode a leftward hook and stopped exactly where grass thinned and rime bowed inland. Knife-tip taste, brine enough. Subfloor answered at 0607, west to east, inward bow under L3, and at 0614, vestry toward aisle, in 3 polite pulses with a pause under the runner. The bell did not lean there. The wind-up clock added a minute, and then gave half back in 3 ticks like somebody remembering his manners late. I logged lack as noun, then wrote restraint applied so I wouldn't congratulate myself later for having done nothing at all. Sundry, a caretaker's fence against the part of the mind that wants to call things by names that do not help. Lamp wick, trimmed to a neat oval, stovepipe damper, a thumb width. Ash carried to the steel bucket. Grave wedges tamped, vestry hinge waxed. The iron keyring set to the rail to warm the hand that would write. On the vestry west wall, the cold stripe had climbed another finger and widened a half palm. Still not wet. Still that cellar chill that makes a wrist bone remember a river. I wrote stripe +1, finger up, widths 1/2 palm, temp drop local, ache steady. I had been drawing maps in chalk and not lifting boards for a week. Today the chalk wanted a boundary. I snapped a clean line along the nave center and wrote small numbers at 16-inch intervals where joists crossed under the aisle runner, 1 through 7, plain marks without a story. I set the folding square to the plank seams around L3, and, because promising yourself reason is sometimes the only discipline you own, set the brace and plug cutter in the vestry, where I could see them and then left them there. I would not lift a board unless the room asked me outright. I wrote that down as if it were an order from someone I'd believe under pressure. Do not open the floor unless invited. At Euro 7:31, the bell leaned late and twice again, 2 small acknowledgments as if excusing a delay. The ladder of beads under the hatch trembled. I heard it as a hush, not a sound, and slid a finger toward the clapper line. No drip. I did not go up. A caretaker earns his keep as much by standing down as by standing up. I wrote, belfry beads migrate, no fall, hold. The repeater gave me the town at U800, the mittened voice lighter for having made it through the night. Caretaker bluff? Here. No bell, he said, almost cheerful with the word. Skiff owners say the river mouth's got its manners back. Folks wanted me to ask if you'd mind saying something for the ones who didn't sleep. I keep a list, I said. He let that sit as if a ledger could be prayer. Be neighborly, he said in the tone you use when you don't want to push a man. Then, softer, count for us if you can. The line went to wool. The room had been teaching me how not to step on its boards. If there was going to be a service, it would have to be the kind that kept time off the wood. I set out the blue-taped hymn ledgers along the rail, severe hands volume on top. It opened where it wanted, my index. A new indented line weighted low in the margin, tight letters pressed through from no ink I owned. When you must speak, do it where the floor doesn't listen. I copied it exact, dated it, wrote my initials so the list would have an owner and not pretend to be scripture, and drew a small line beneath so it would not climb. 9 o'clock belonged to nobody and everybody. I did the job a caretaker is allowed. I opened the north shutters to the thin ceiling and left the south barred because the wind had ideas. I put the wind-up clock 1 minute slow to make room. It took the room without argument. I set the iron keyring on the ledger's index so the pressed lines would feel held. Then I stood not at the rail but on the step of the chancel, where the joists run crosswise and the runner keeps its own counsel, and I spoke, not sang, the shortest hymn in the book. My voice stayed small and even. I cut the 7th into a soft breath that could pass for a pause. I did not step. I did not lean. I kept my feet off the measure. The bell did not answer the omission. On the little rest after, it leaned 3 seconds and returned like a neighbor tipping his head from the fence. Under the floor, a soft, corky thump answered, not under L3, not under the right front, but under the center aisle at my chalkmark 4, as if the joists had chosen to stand in a line with me without pressing foot or thought into the boards. The delayed cleat nail squeak arrived on time from the choir rail. My ear heard it on the west wall a half-beat later, as if the room were reminding itself how to behave. The window's facets brightened together, dimmed together. The ladder under the hatch trembled once and held. The clock kept the minute I had made for it. I wrote the sequence as if I were taking attendance at a school that had finally learned to line up, after I did not close the book. The Severe Hands volume lay open on the bench, the index showing all the pressed lines we had agreed to own. The iron keyring clicked once where it lay, and a polite echo click answered from beneath the altar shelf where the clock sits. I let the sound be what it was in the room that had made it. The day went to jobs that pay precisely because they are smaller than whatever else is asking for your attention. I oiled the latch I had been ignoring. I retied the stove door spring. I brushed pine needles from the south gutter and set the chain straight where a gust had put a kink in it. I wrote bar holds, wind S with east habit, cove dark, skiffs quiet. Under the floor, the polite procession came vestry to aisle a handful of times, always pausing under the runner, always choosing inward over up. I left the brace and plug cutter on the vestry shelf where they could mind one another and refrained. At noon, the village voice came back and did not ask for a bell. "You keep your list?" "I'm keeping it," I said. "Then we're kept," he said, and signed off with the weather like a man who has earned his tea. I walked the fence in the early afternoon and found the ovals had written themselves across my boot line in both directions again. At the corner hump they crowded. At the cliff they hooked left and stopped where the rime bowed inland. Down in the cove, the pale runs held their 3 parallel grammar angled from the river seam toward our stones. I stood with the staff planted and did not pace the distance between my chalkmark 4 and the seat where the polite thump had sounded. I did not count the ovals. I tasted 1 grain on the knife and let it be salt only, not sentence. Inside, the attic crawl above L3 showed the fine salt ladder with its rungs biasing belfryward, 1 clear bead holding at the side as if saving its place. I slid the square of hymnal flyleaf beneath it again. It did not fall. The bead quivered, slid along the rung a finger's width, and settled where the hatch brace would place its ladder when the wind remembered to press. I wrote, "Attic ladder holds, bead slides lateral, paper remains dry." I backed out slow so I would not teach the boards where my knees preferred to go. A house will ask once, then leave you to your work if you answer properly. The bell offered no long breath at the hour. The cleat nail minded its delay. The clock kept the minute I had made, and gained none until 15:19, when it took 1 back as a loan and returned half in 3 ticks. I let it pass. A person makes room where he can. Toward evening, the ceiling thinned enough that the village roofs looked like cards turned face up. A boy in a red cap walked a porch rail and dropped to the steps like a person who has not yet learned to be careful. The seam at the river mouth held its confidence. The skiff sat with men working hands into sleeves and not choosing the water. The fence beads lost their fatness, became orderly again. The ovals along the south wall did not renew. The rime boo on the cliff grass faded to a memory, and then returned when the wind shrugged south for a breath, like a habit admitting itself. I added in nouns small enough to carry: service, spoken at chancel step; 7th cut to breath, bell leans on rest; subfloor answers at chalkmark 4, feet kept off boards; ledger, pressed, when you must speak, do it where the floor doesn't listen, copied and owned; belfry, ladder beads migrate on wind, tremble together, no fall; attic, salt ladder holds, bead slides laterally, paper dry; stripe, vestry, you always have palm, temp drop local, ache steady; prints, cove, ovals cross boot line both ways; hook left at cliff, 3 run grammar holds, do not pace; clock, accepts room, occasional intra-tick loans and returns; dusk asked for its ordinary. I barred the south, left 1 north pane bare because telling the truth to a habit only works if the habit can hear you. I set the clock 1 minute slow to make room for the night. It took the room like a tool pleased to mind its craft. I put the iron key ring on the ledger's index and set my palm there longer than counting would require. The cleat nail squeaked from the choir rail on time, and, half a beat later, from the west wall, as if the room had not forgotten how to be 2 places at once. The stove gave its careful cough. The panes shivered a small, bright tone, and went quiet together. The last thing a caretaker is allowed is a look he cannot justify. I climbed as far as the 3rd tread and stopped at the frost filament I had not cut twice. It had curved toward the aisle until a person could call it a bowstring without deceiving himself. I touched it with the back of the knife. It bowed and held and did not snap. I left it again. When I lay on the vestry cot, the inlet spoke its grammar without needing me. 3, 3, the long thought that breaks. On the small rest after, the bell leaned a neighbor's 3 seconds, and from beneath the altar shelf the hollow click sounded like a key finding a lock that nobody had set. The clock did not chime. The ledger lay open on the bench where the keyring held the page. The pressed lines did not add themselves, or if they did, I lacked the courage to look. I wrote one last entry smaller than the rest, so the page would not decide to mean more than it could carry. End of thaw service. House keeps its own beat. Caretaker keeps feet off boards. Bell honest without rope. Minutes given room. Water climbs where it will and is not to be followed. I closed the ledger with my palm, flat, ordinary, as if closing a hatch against a polite weather. Then I turned the wind-up key once, only once, and set the clock 1 minute slow to make room for whatever would ask a place in the night. It took the room, and I let it keep it. Somewhere between the 6th and the thought I will not name, the choir rail gave a courteous tap on a rest I hadn't kept for it, and the ladder beneath the hatch trembled together. No bead fell. The boards under L3 breathed inward and returned. The fence outside made its right creak from the right place, and, a half beat later, from the other place it has learned to be. The house and the water agreed on a measure they did not need me to count. I did not count. I listened until the listening let me go.